any commissioners that might be running a little bit behind. Oh, I see we're live on YouTube. So we might as well get into the intro then.
All right, so welcome to the fifth panel of Transforming Foundations, a series of virtual panels hosted by the Racial Justice Commission with guest practitioners and thought leaders about what is necessary to disrupt systematic racism and make racial equity a reality in the areas such as health, education, housing, and environmental justice in New York City. Each week, commissioners will gain ideas to transform the city's foundational laws to embody racial justice and fairness. So the Racial Justice Commission has the powers of a charter revision commission, meaning we will be submitting proposals to change the city's charter, which the public will vote on, hopefully in the 2022 election. Our proposals are intended to make the city move towards structural change that embody greater racial equity, a city where the worth, talents, and contributions of all people in society are valued and recognized, a city where race is not a deterministic indicator of economic, political, social, or social psychological outcomes, nor one that confers privileges and denies opportunities for individuals. So we have a series of commissioners here today. I think I will defer and let them introduce themselves rather than go through and introduce. So perhaps commissioners, if you could briefly introduce yourself and then pass to another one, that would be helpful. And I guess I should lead. I am Derek Hamilton, a commissioner with the Racial Justice Commission. And I'll pass to Henry.
Good afternoon, Commissioner Hamilton. Thank you, Henry Garrido. I'm Vice Chair of the Commission and glad to be here.
Chris Coy, also a member of the Commission.
Good afternoon, Lorelei Daniel Favors, also a member of the Commission. Very excited about this conversation.
Good afternoon, Joanne Yu, member of the Commission.
And I should mention, I am filling in today in large part to our chair, and I'm sure I won't do as an adequate job as she would if she was here today. All right, let me explain today's mission. The ideas we hear from today's panelists will be considered by the Commission for charter changes, and will certainly inform how we think about and make our final recommendations. Let me offer some guidance on format today. This is a panel discussion which serves as listening session for commissioners to hear ideas from thought leaders in the field and engage them in thoughtful Q&A, but it is not a forum for commissioners to debate, discuss, or come to decision about the ideas that we hear today. This is distinguished from a commission meeting, a formal public meeting at which commissioners do engage in debate and deliberation and ultimately make decisions. We are going to describe a couple of upcoming events, and then we're going to get into the panel. So we're going to invite the public to testify before the commission tomorrow, August 11th at 5:30 in Harlem. Details can be found about this meeting at the website nyc.gov/racial justice. So I have the honor of introducing the first of three panels. So first, as you heard me say in the beginning, my colleague, James Parrott, is the Director of Economic and Fiscal Policies at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School. His recent research focuses on the economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis in New York City and an analysis of the magnitude of gig and other low-paid independent contract work in New York. Then we have Michael Gardner, who is the Chief Diversity Officer at the MTA. He has made it his personal and professional mission to create a more diverse industry by empowering minority-owned and women-owned businesses throughout the state, Since arriving at the MTA in 2010, Garner has designed one of the country's leading business development programs for minority-owned, women-owned, and disadvantaged business enterprises. And then we have Jose Ortiz Jr., who is CEO of New York City Employment and Training Coalition, the largest city-based workforce development association in the city. As CEO of the NYCETC, Jose leads an association of more than 180 independent organizations, including community-based organizations, colleges and universities, and labor unions that provide skills, training, and education to 500,000 New Yorkers. Jose has been involved in New York City nonprofit sector for nearly 16 years and has dedicated his career to building equitable pathways for workforce development that align with racial and social justice. So, as was mentioned, this is an exciting, well-informed panel we're about to have, but I do want to remind each of the panelists that we have 8 minutes and we have 3 other panels today. So please be crisp, don't be rushed, but be cognizant of your fellow panelists that we have 8 minutes. So let's please begin with.
Just sorry to interrupt, Commissioner Hamilton. I wanted to note that Jose Ortiz, unfortunately, will not be joining us today. He was excited to, but unfortunately is out sick. So just wanted to note one change to our agenda for the day.
Thank you. So that 8 minutes might not be so rushed, but keep in mind we do have more panels later today. So please, James, with no further ado, begin.
Thank you very much. Certainly, it's an honor to be invited to testify before the Racial Justice Commission. I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts about how to make New York City more racially equitable and about how to close the racial wealth gap. These are paramount objectives as the city struggles to emerge from the COVID-19 economic crisis and as it approaches 2022 and the broad changeover in city leadership that will bring. I could begin by noting that it would really be helpful for whatever the city does to have the wind of more supportive national policies at our back. So there are many things that could be done at the national level that would make the job of advancing racial equity smoother in New York City. But that's not our focus today, so I won't go into those. There are several policies that can make a considerable difference in enhancing racial equity at the local level. Several city policies in recent years made discernible progress, although the COVID-19 economic crisis threatens to undo much of that, a topic to which I will return at the end of my comments this afternoon. An essential step in improving the functioning of labor markets is to establish a meaningful floor for compensation and working conditions. City, and in some cases, state actions in recent years have demonstrated this. The minimum wage more than doubled between 2013 and 2019. And together with strong job growth and the longest period of low unemployment rates since the 1960s, we saw wages rise for workers in the bottom half of the income spectrum more than at any time in the past 50 years. I have some numbers that speak to this, which I could go into if there's time in the Q&A. The city has also made considerable progress in expanding labor protections to the hundreds of thousands of independent contractors, including many low-paid workers who are misclassified as independent contractors. The Taxi and Limousine Commission's first in the nation minimum for-hire vehicle driver pay standard raised the pay for 80,000 Uber and Lyft drivers by an estimated $300 million in 2019. Legislation that hopefully will soon pass the City Council would authorize a minimum compensation standard for tens of thousands of restaurant delivery workers. The city has also acted to mandate 5 paid sick days, provide fast food and retail workers with fair scheduling protections, and has provided just cause protections for fast food workers. The city should complete the work it started in July 2019 to provide comprehensive compensation equity to tens of thousands of center-based early child care providers and extend a similar commitment to home-based child care providers. This workforce is overwhelmingly women of color. The same is true of the city's human services contract workforce. For too long, the city has shortchanged these organizations and their workers by paying 75 to 80 cents on the dollar for what comparably skilled municipal employees receive, and by not supporting decent health care and retirement security coverage. Through community hiring legislation and related procurement actions, the city could better harness its considerable economic power to prioritize hiring and developing the skills of 40,000 residents of low-income neighborhoods. Let me now shift to talk about the disparate wealth inequity dimension, an area where the city has much further to go. Local tax, land use, and housing policies have long favored the already wealthy and intensified racial wealth disparities. At the top of my list is the imperative to reform New York City's antiquated real property tax system. For the past 3 years, I've been a member of the New York City Advisory Commission on Property Tax Reform. For 40 years, provisions of New York City's property tax system have allowed a host of inequities to worsen that favor owners of higher valued properties and residents of neighborhoods where property values have significantly appreciated since 1981. With a set of preliminary recommendations that we issued in January of 2020, and with further recommendations that we are currently refining, by the end of this year, we hope to present to the state legislature an overhaul package that will equalize effective property tax burdens and do that in a way that protects low and moderate households and shifts more of the tax burden to higher valued and non-primary resident owned properties. The city's personal income tax structure is only slightly progressive, with considerable room to enhance low income tax credits and balance some of the tax benefits, such as the exclusion of retirement contributions or pension benefits that heavily benefit high income households. In this vein, the city should proceed to establish low-cost city-managed retirement savings accounts for lower-income private sector workers and consider ways to incentivize retirement savings for the millions of low-income city residents who have little or no retirement savings. One of the ways the city can foster racial equity is by reducing the cost of living for low-income households. For example, by providing a public banking option that eliminates costly fees. Since land use actions such as upzonings can have substantial impacts on land values, the city needs to get serious about developing value capture mechanisms to ensure that the people of New York are able to more directly benefit from decisions on how to utilize the limited land area and development potential within city limits. I'm not a housing expert, but there must be good models for how the city can build affordable housing that is permanently affordable. I'd like to close by discussing what I see as an urgent priority for the city that does not require a charter change or even enabling state legislation. It's entirely a matter of political will with racial equity in the balance. As of June, nearly 500,000 jobs dislocated by COVID's lopsided impact had not returned. And with more than 3/4 of these jobs held by workers of color. These jobs and the businesses that employed these workers were sacrificed for public health reasons. Government has an obligation to make these workers and businesses whole. Yet that is not happening. And if we leave things to, quote, market forces, we will see the same thing happen that happened after other significant economic downturns in New York City. Black and brown workers will endure double-digit unemployment rates for 3, 4, or 5 or more years until they return to gainful employment. We know the economic, personal, and social harm that would cause, and that this would undo a lot of the economic progress made in recent years. This outcome can be averted if the city begins to invest now in establishing a massive workforce reallocation system to identify those workers likely to be permanently displaced, assess their career needs, and invest in the education and training services they need to connect to better jobs with a future in advancement opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And may we move to the next panelist? Michael, please.
Yes, hi, I'm Michael J Garner. I'm the Vice President, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the MTA. I'm also in my night career, After 5 career. I'm the most immediate past president of the founding chapter of the 100 Black Men for the past 6 years. Now I'm the chairman of the corporate board. I'm also part of the Eric Garner family. Eric Garner, as you know, was killed by a law enforcement officer in Staten Island in 2014. And the family, we had the vision to fight to have the officer terminated from city employment, in addition to working with Nan and Al Sharpton and the governor to get a bill passed called the Eric Garner Anti-Choking Bill. It's one thing to demonstrate, but once everything is done, what are you going to do about it? And so we did, in the words of Bob Marley, the family fought for its rights, and we got that bill passed. Now the chokehold is illegal, and anyone who uses it can be prosecuted by the fullest extent of the law. Let me say that at the MTA, we're the largest transportation network in North America. We are a $1 trillion organization if you include our equipment and our real estate and property, $1 trillion organization. Pre-COVID, we transported 6.2 million people a day to their jobs in other places. We also have an annual $16 billion budget. In addition to that, we have a $54.8 billion capital budget over the next 5 years, investing in the region's infrastructure and capital, new signals, new countdown clocks, new security cameras, new subway trains, new buses, new commuter rails to ensure that we are getting our customers to their places safely and on time. We also spend an additional $6 through $7 billion in goods and services every year. And so we are currently ranked #1 when it comes to dollars paid out of 97 agencies and state authorities in the state of New York. Just 2 years ago, we paid $742 million to New York State minority and women-owned businesses. In addition to that, we are also the largest recipient of mass transit funding in the nation. And so if you add up the dollars that we paid to New York State certified MWBEs on both our New York State funded projects and our FTA funded projects, that number increases to $1.1 billion that we paid in 1 year to a New York State certified MWBE firms. And why is that important? We are in the Fortune 500 capital of the world, but where there's billions of dollars of transactions taking place every day. But if you get in your car and drive up Madison Avenue, past all the upscale, glitzy shops, and you enter Harlem, and you drive over the 138th Street Bridge, you are in the Bronx. As a matter of fact, you're in the South Bronx. The Bronx is the 3rd poorest county in the country. Not the state of New York, but the 3rd poorest county in the country. How is that possible? To have Fortune 500 capital of the world over one bridge where there's billions of dollars of transactions taking place, but yet you drive 2 or 3 miles over a bridge and you're in the 3rd poorest county in the country. Let me say that we at the MTA, we have the ability to award taxpayer-driven dollars in contracts in a cost-effective manner because this taxpayers' money is being spent. But we also have the ability to award those contracts in an inclusive manner, inclusive to the MWBE firms. And the reason why that's important is because access to government contracts equals home ownership, job creation in those communities, better healthcare options, and better educational opportunities. Because if you take one element of eliminating poverty in this great city and state and nation that we live in, one answer will solve 95% of the problems that the adverse conditions of Blacks and brown and other minorities and women are experiencing in this country, and that's poverty. But if you have access to a contract or a well-paying job, you will eradicate 95% of those adverse living conditions that the Black and brown communities are currently living in right now in our city. The tale of two cities, South Bronx or the Bronx versus Manhattan. And so as I have historically advised cities and states and in corporate America of how to incorporate a inclusive minority business program, it's not brain surgery. It is accountability. It is the support of the CEO. Isn't it amazing that in this country that we live in right now, the largest employer of Blacks in our country is government, city government, state government, federal government, because the private sector has never hired Blacks in a number that we should be hired in. In 2021, I'm not intelligent enough to have a conversation with Apple to simply ask a question, why are there no Blacks on your corporate board? And so this is not brain surgery, but it is about accountability. I would say, historically speaking, that the state of New York has done a fantastic job of incorporating minority women-owned businesses in their spend. Just 2 years ago, 97 agencies paid a total of $3.1 billion to minority women-owned firms. And you know the reason why it's important, because of job creation and home ownership, better education opportunities, and better healthcare options. We have the highest MWBE goals in the nation, 30%. There was a mandate that came down from Albany. Not less than 30% of your contracts will be awarded to New York State certified MWBE firms. And so, you know, I had a rude awakening the other day, but it was a great awakening. I was listening to NBC News when they indicated that COVID-19 has adversely affected women in this great country that we live in. So I came back and I asked my staff to generate some numbers for me. I wanted to know how many dollars that we paid to women-owned businesses last year and the previous year. And in 2 years, we've paid almost $1 billion to women-owned firms. And so, as opposed to creating or getting mid-level jobs where you are going to pay someone $15 an hour, why not create business opportunities? Put those diverse businesses in a space where they are winning contracts. Then they are hiring people who look like them. And that's a way for us to begin to focus on eradicating poverty in this great city and this great state and the great nation that we live in. And so having effective programming, having effective paid job training programs that we can borrow and update from the 1960s when we had model cities and CETA, bringing those job programs back to train people and then place them in corporate jobs in city and state and federal jobs. That's what we should be focusing on right now as a means and as a way of eradicating poverty in this great city that we live in right now. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. This is the moment where we're going to open up to fellow commissioners Q&A to provide some comments, questions, and get into a bit of a discussion. And I want to apologize for using first names as opposed to formality. And obviously, it was not meant in any disrespect, but I should have referred to our guest panelists as Dr. Parrott and Chief Diversity Officer Garner, because you deserve the respect that your professional accomplishments have attained. All right, any questions from fellow commissioners? Commissioner Garrido, you want to go first?
Yes, Mr. Chair, good afternoon again. James, the commission has heard over the last few weeks testimonies from various individuals talking about the disparity in salaries for social workers and for other mental health providers at a time that we are the most needs. We've also heard about the inequities in many of the titles as it applies to salary, recruitment, retention, and other issues. I think you mentioned retirement security. But I think one of the things that we've been struggling is what are the practical applications for the city charter itself? So we've been talking about procurement. I think yesterday at the hearing, we talked about procurement and, you know, in the context of minority-owned firms and other things. But in terms of amending the charter, it becomes a little harder to try to mandate a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to the city. What would be some of the recommendations you would make in practical applications on city charter revision that would have the greatest impact in shrinking, if not eliminating completely, those inequities that we were talking about before?
That's a great question, Henry. I think that in order to well, let me say that I don't think there's any constraint currently on the city in being able to pay human service contract workers on a comparable basis with city employees in similar job titles. I don't think there's any impediment right now that I'm aware of. It would certainly facilitate and ensure that, you know, on a going forward on a year in and year out basis, if such a requirement were embodied in the city charter. Before making any significant progress in this area, the city really needs to undertake an analysis to standardize the job titles that are covered in the human services contract work that it procures. Right now, there's no standard set of job titles, and it's basically up to the individual nonprofit human service providers on what job titles they employ. If the city contracts, which are under the control of the city, move toward a standard set of job titles, then it would help facilitate paying city workers with comparable job titles, comparable pay. So I think that analysis is something that is long overdue. It should be undertaken by the city. The city has the resources to do that. The city would certainly benefit. The city's procurement process, I think, would be more uniform and transparent if it had such a system of standardized job titles. And then that, of course, would provide the basis for comparable pay when the city gets to carry out that commitment.
So let me follow through with this argument. If the charter were to be amended to reflect the procurement, to reflect certain principles, in this case, let's say the standardization of titles, and those are done through procurement capability of the city, wouldn't the state have to put the differences the state pays for a portion of those contracts? And will the city charter apply for state, mandate when in fact it's paid by both city and state, or city and federal for that matter.
Yeah, no, so it does become an issue when a nonprofit employs a worker who's working under state contract. I mean, it doesn't, I'm not a procurement expert, but it doesn't seem to me that city procurement has any authority over positions in nonprofits that are mainly or entirely state funded. I think the state would need to make a similar commitment on that. I know that there are active discussions at the federal level on how to enhance the federal procurement process in order to get away from, a practice that's been in effect for the last 30 years or so of relying on basically low-cost bidders as the criteria for procurement selection. And we've seen lots of evidence that doesn't always lead to the best quality in government goods and services procured. And it certainly doesn't lead to good labor practices or good compensation practices. So there's an active discussion at the federal level on how to enhance procurement procedures in order to make sure that workers are paid, consistent with the provision of quality services. So the extent to which that helps sort of nudge the state to a better position for its own policies or procurement, that will represent progress.
Let me add to that. So at the MTA, and I've worked at 3 organizations in my 38-year career. First at NYCHA, then at the School Construction Authority, and now at the MTA. And so there's a concept in procurement that we call awarding contracts to the lowest responsible bidder. And that's in addition to a hard bid. And so when you go through the RFP process, the owner or the agency has the ability to dictate titles, dictates pay, and there is a concept that we also use that's called prevailing wages, ensuring that contractors and our consultants who are doing business with you are paying the established prevailing wage. And so those are two of the strategies that we use to make sure that a contract is going to be awarded not only to the lowest bidder, but to the lowest responsive bidder. And that responsiveness can be a number of things. And basically also ensuring through audit and through compliance that contractors are paying prevailing wages.
So I don't want to put any words in either one of your mouth, but are you suggesting, both of you, that one possible solution for the commission to consider was to amend procurement policy rules that would not necessarily go to the list, but that we sort of flip this and put the most responsible bidders, which include prevailing wages or standardized wages, as a concept before we go to the least, being the lowest?
It's already happening in certain agencies and certain city agencies and state agencies. That's already happening. If you look at some of the most successful agencies.
My point, Mr. Garner, my point is exactly that, which is, then why would this make any difference? If it's already happening and you suggested we made the amendment, why would it make a difference of the stuff that Mr. Parrott was proposing before?
Well, I mean, there's always 1,000 laws in the books, but are those laws being enforced? And so if you want to ensure that certain things are happening, then you use the power of the audit and you use the power of oversight and compliance to ensure that those policies are in fact being enforced.
I do think that it would certainly be an improvement to have that spelled out in the city charter. In practice, regarding New York City human services contract, the concept of prevailing wage is not an operative one in that contracting world, and it would make sense to bring that in as a basis and to explain or define what is meant by prevailing wage in a human services context.
Commissioner Favors? You have a next question. Sorry, I'm moving us along. Sorry.
No worries. I appreciate the discussion. I'd like to speak or hear Dr. Garner, you speak a bit about with a little bit more depth about the status of the MTA's commitment to contracting with MWBEs. We've had an opportunity to learn a lot about the MWBE process throughout the course of our hearings. And one of the things that seems to be a repeated, or one of the things that seems to be a pattern is that when we're talking about awarding contracts to MWBEs, what we're typically talking about is awarding contracts to white women. With a very low emphasis actually placed on awarding contracts to Black women, Asian women, Latino women, so on and so forth. And I'd like to know if you could speak a bit more about your observation, particularly because you have spent such an extensive amount of time in public service. Can you speak with us a bit about some of the inherent discrepancies that exist even within this existing program that is designed to ensure more equitable distribution of resources? If you could compare for us, as your observations would allow, the realities of that program as it pertains to who is actually getting the money on the ground as compared to the lauded goals of the program.
Right. And thanks a lot for giving me a PhD without me studying for it, but that's all well, fine and good. Thank you. So when you talk about contracting in government, and I've been in three organizations. At the MTA, I was brought here because 12 years ago, the MTA was dead last, and out of 97 agencies and state authorities were paying dollars to minority women-owned firms. So when I got here, the MTA was paying an average of $114 million a year, which equated to 6% MWBE inclusion. Fast forward with the support of our CEOs, the governor's office, our board, the state assembly, and the state senate, we focused on building programming that allowed us to now award and pay a record number of contracts to minority women-owned businesses. And so from that $114 million 12 years ago, we are now up to $1.1 billion. And so we also have the ability, because the MTA is a large builder. I mean, we have billion-dollar projects. Second Avenue subway, extending it from 96 to 125th Street, is an $8 billion project. Third track in Nassau and Suffolk County, adding a third track, that's a $2 billion project. East Side Access, linking Penn Station to Grand Central, that's a $12 billion project. So we needed to start debundling. So we created the MTA Small Business Mentoring Program. We went to the state capitol and we got a law change, which allows us to pre-qualify contractors and set aside projects so these smaller contractors can bid on. We waive their bonding, we pay them in 10 days, we make them go through a 16-week mandatory training process because we wanted them to understand how to finish the MTA's projects safely, timely, and on budget, but also train the business person how to become a better business person. Because you can be a great carpenter or great plumber, but if you do not submit your invoices on a timely basis, at a short period of time, you will be insolvent. And so we took these programs and now we are awarding a record number. So for example, the MTA has the largest discretionary threshold. That means that we have the ability to go into the marketplace, solicit prices from 2 or 3 minority women-owned firms, make the award right there on the spot without going out for more broader bidding. Our threshold is $1 million. Every other state agency and city agency has a $500,000 threshold. So for example, let me give you a case in point briefly. So we are a large user of hardware, IT, printers, and the rest. So we went to two of our manufacturers and said, HP and Dell. We said, we want you to extend your special discount pricing to minority women-owned businesses who are certified in the state of New York, because Governor Cuomo wanted to maximize opportunities for these firms. And so, and our concept is, it is better for us to send a purchase order, to issue a purchase order to a local minority women-owned firm, as opposed to sending that purchase order down to Austin, Texas, and then getting those boxes shipped up. And so we asked them to extend their special discount pricing. So Dell said yes, HP said no. We called HP back the next day and told them that we were taking all of their business and giving it to Dell. They called us back the next day and they said that we're in. And so taking that purchase order and buying our hardware from a local minority women-owned firm based in Harlem or based somewhere else in the city, they will hire more staff and pay more taxes. It's a win-win for everyone. And so now you asked me a question about the disparity within the disparity. White women getting the bulk of contracts. And so we've tracked our payments to minority-owned firms for the past 10 years. In every sector, Black, Hispanic, Asian Indian, Asian Pacific, and white women, we've quadrupled payments in each one of those categories. When we find that we are not awarding the appropriate number of contracts to any ethnic group, we're borrowing a page from Mayor Bill de Blasio, and we're focusing on that sector. And so the city of New York now has a whole total program that's focused on Black business. Why is it that Black businesses are not getting their fair share of contracts? Is it because they need training? Is it because they need to be better integrated into the actual procurement process? And so we are in fact doing that, and we're seeing success in some of the things that we're doing. And I see that our Deputy Mayor Phil Thompson just jumped on, and he has done an incredible job of empowering Black-owned businesses and other minority businesses for the city of New York. And as I indicated, the city of New York has one of the only focused strategies that's focused on the state of Black businesses. Why is it Black businesses are not getting their fair share? What is it that they need? Access to capital, access to surety bonding, mentoring programs. And so these are some of the strategies that we are doing in order to award taxpayer-driven contracts by the MTA in an inclusive manner.
As a follow-up, and I thank you so much for that insight, it's very helpful. Do you know if there are any inquiries that seek to understand why it is that white women were getting a disproportionate share of contracts, as opposed to focusing on the deficits that are present in perhaps why Black organizations were not? We're hearing a lot of themes that seem to consistently speak to overcompensation of goods, benefits, and privileges. And while I'm elated to know that there is a focus on Black businesses, when we're thinking about structural changes, not wanting to sort of pinpoint specific issues that we may have a very specific type of solution for, or some sort of inquiry for, as we think about the structural changes that we're seeking to make, you know, if there's any insight into why it is that before this emphasis on looking at what was happening with Black businesses, has there been any insight to your knowledge or inquiry to your knowledge that asks why it is that white women were able to engage in this program that was specifically for the benefit of all minorities in a way that was disproportionate to their fair share?
You can talk about, and I have not done a study, but it's observation that they are better adept at networking. They're better capitalized. They have the expertise, so their capital allows them to hire better expertise. Because when you talk about Black businesses and Hispanic businesses, there's been historical practices like redlining or not approving loans. If you don't have access to capital, you don't have the ability to grow your business, to hire expertise, to take your business to the next level. And so we started to focus on hiring institutions that will issue loans. So for example, the MTA, we went out via an RFP and we hired Carver's Federal Savings Bank to issue loans to those firms of color who have historically been shut out of the marketplace. And so I would say better networking, better marketing, more access to capital, and the ability to hire more experienced workforce in order to execute the mission of that company. And so we're now starting to address the gap, and we're now seeing more awards being awarded to Black-owned businesses, Hispanic-owned businesses.
Thank you.
So, Commissioner, you, and then I will jump in with some questions afterwards.
Right, this has been really illuminating, but I actually have a question. And I don't know if it's a question that I need to throw to staff to find out, but I think Mr. Garner, certainly you might have an idea. But I've often heard that there's a flaw in the way we actually count MWBE. And, I appreciate Commissioner Favor's comments, all your comments and what Commissioner Favors has brought out. And I also want to add to her comments is that I heard that the way MWBE is counted, if you have, let's say, 10 Asian organizations, small businesses or businesses signed up with a certain city entity, and if 10, pretty small number, but if 9 of them get a contract, that's considered 90% success. And so I actually have a question about how even MWBE is counted. And I don't know if you know the answer, but also Anusha, if that's something that we need to bring, because it's not even about, it's the fact that so few people are registering, but few people are getting the contracts. But then, the few that are getting that can't just be into overall success of, look, the Asians have 90% success rate with MWB. Isn't it fantastic when there's only 10 businesses in that MWBE model? So I don't know if you know the answer. I don't know if it's something that we need to also understand for ourselves. The staff need to help the commissioners, but I just was wondering if you knew the answer to that. Thank you.
Okay, so yes, I'm not aware of any counting in that way, but I can tell you that at the MTA, we do look at the availability of firms. We also reach out to various communities. So let's say, for example, we increased the number of Asian American companies in 1 year. But we don't rest upon our laurels, because what we then do is that we bring those firms in to something that we call a new firm orientation. And so once a firm is certified, we have the ability pre-COVID to bring them here to 2 Broadway on our 20th floor. We have our 6 different MTA operating agencies there: Transit, MTA Bus, Long Island Railroad, Metro Northland, et cetera. And we integrate those companies into our procurement practices. And so, but you lost me when you indicated of how the certain groups are counted. We count not only how many firms are certified, but also we count how many dollars are paid to that group during a year. That's how we track our metrics.
Thank you, sir. I guess, thank you, Mr. Garner. I guess this is a question for, then we can touch base with Anusha. I can share some information with you. Thank you.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I think I'm going to have the final set of questions on this panel, because we're going to transition, and I have questions for both experts. The first one is asking a little bit more about the role of capital as it relates to dispersion of access to contracts, procurement. So to me, it seems like the most dramatic input across race and ethnicity in terms of being successful in bidding and having access to contracts is capital itself. And of course, loans is a mechanism to provide additional capital, but perhaps an imperfect measure. So my question is, are there any mechanisms to redress the historical disparities associated with capital that lead to perhaps some structural discrepancies in the ways in which people from one demographic may have access to entrepreneurial contractual arrangements with MTA or any other city agencies that the commission should be thinking about addressing? And then I have some questions for James around, in your presentation, one thing that you touched upon was tax reform. And oftentimes people think about taxes as only a mechanism of revenue generation. But in your conversation, you had some discussion of ways in which tax reform could be economically empowering. You even referenced the possibility of refundable tax credits. So one part is, can you elaborate a little more? And then you also referenced public banking, public options as a mechanism of economic empowerment. Maybe I want to offer you an opportunity to elaborate a little more on that and any other types of direct interventions that New York City can engage in that could manifest in a way to empower people, particularly as it relates to racial and ethnic inclusion.
So your access to capital question is spot on. You cannot effectively enter the marketplace or conduct business in the marketplace without having access to capital. I'm a student of history. I know that back in the 1970s, early 80s, that Maynard Jackson, the former mayor of the great city of Atlanta, when the city fathers wanted to expand the airport, and Maynard Jackson shut it down because they did not demonstrate how they were going to include minority-owned businesses in that. And then after a period of 6 to 8 months, they came to the table with a very viable plan to include minority-owned businesses, contractors, architects, engineers in the expansion of the Jackson Hartsfield Airport. And Maynard Jackson also called all of the banks together and said that he wanted them to create a access to capital program, or he was going to take city dollars out of those banks and put those city dollars in banks where they was going to come to the table with access to credit programs. And so in the world of construction, banks do not like contractors because one bad business can put you out of business. And they really hate small and minority-owned contractors because a lot of these contractors are not as savvy as they could be because of exclusionary historical practices that did not allow them to enter the marketplace. And so when we put our RFP out in a former life at the School Construction Authority, we got one response back, and that response was from Carver. When I came to the MTA and incorporated that same program, we got one response back from our RFP, and that was Carver. Although I know that the city and the state now have more banks that have come to the table to issue capital, if this commission can encourage the city to continue to have banks come to the marketplace that will give capital to these certified minority women-owned businesses and Black businesses and brown businesses, you will see them with the ability to enter the marketplace, stay in the marketplace, hire competent staff, market themselves, and better be able to respond to contract and RFP opportunities. So access to capital is the equalizer.
Yeah. Thank you. And I just want to quickly interject before we go to James, and that is, historically, it wasn't always through lending that groups have had access to capital. So I just want to remind us that the state and public sector has, at least historically, and then I'm thinking of the MTA $1 trillion organizational number that was mentioned in the beginning, where perhaps there are ways that one could get to access to capital irrespective of banks and lending also. Just food for thought.
Yes, there are other alternative lending programs, and they are working great. And so if you couple that with your larger banks or your niche banks in order to providing capital to companies who have been historically excluded, you will start to see a sea change.
Thank you. James, sorry. You're muted.
There we go. I think it's that there are important ways in which the New York City tax structure can better foster wealth creation. I mean, it has an impact on fostering wealth creation now. My first big point on tax reform was the property tax system in New York City. It's every bit as bad as what you've heard. It's resisted reform for 40 years. I think we're very close to getting to having a very compelling tax reform proposal that will go a long way toward equalizing effective property tax rates and lessen the tax burden on a lot of lower valued properties in low and moderate income neighborhoods in the boroughs outside of Manhattan. So that there's clearly a lot at stake for everybody in New York, that we're able to put together a compelling property tax reform, and that we get the support of our state legislators and whoever the governor is at the time for that. So hopefully we will take that big step. There are various ways in which the income tax system, though, can better enable progressive wealth creation in New York City. And by progressive, I mean more racially equitable wealth creation. Right now, the city's tax structure piggybacks on the state and federal government's definitions of taxable income. Thereby, we effectively grant pretty significant tax breaks to retirement savings. The tax-based retirement savings incentives in the federal tax code largely benefit very well-to-do people. And New York City basically carries that exclusion from taxable income over to the local structure. We should try, the city's finance department does estimate the value of that. We should take that and put that on the table as the city should think about allocating, subject to budget constraints, a comparable amount of money to incentivize retirement savings for less wealthy people in New York City. And we could do that through a refundable tax credit. The city has the basis for a refundable earned income tax credit. At this point, it's only 5% of the federal. I'm happy to report that Eric Adams had a pretty good proposal for enhancing. He said during the campaign he was interested in putting $1 billion into an enhanced refundable earned income tax credit in New York City. So hopefully we'll see more discussion along those lines. On the public banking question, I think some of the experts testifying in the second panel are much more knowledgeable in this area than I am. It's really unfortunate what takes place at present, and that it's been tolerated for as long as it has. So many people excluded from the banking system, having to rely upon really exorbitantly costly check cashing services and payday lending and so on. The private market is not sufficiently it's not recognizing and offering solutions to those. So hence, I think there's a legitimate case to be made for a public banking solution to be talked about and taken seriously. And I hope this commission is is pursuing that.
Thank you. So I want to offer our gratitude for the worth of knowledge, the commitment, and the passion that you both bring to these issues and to this discussion. And we hope that you will be available to us if we need to come back, which I suspect we may need to, with further query and further information. And we're going to transition to the next panel. But before we do, our chair is here, and as well as Commissioner Thompson joined us. So I'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves.
Beginning with the chair.
I was deferring to you. I'm Jennifer Jones Austin, and I thank you all for being present and for sharing with us, imparting to us your knowledge and your wisdom. And I apologize to you that I wasn't able to join until just now. I was actually I was presenting to a National Baptist convention on structural racism and critical race theory. And we know that we need the faith community engaged in this fight along with us. So I hope that you will forgive me for not being here. I will replay the tape and I will listen in. I am glad to say that there are persons who presented this afternoon who I have had the pleasure and privilege of working with on several issues, but there's more to be learned. Thank you for being here.
And I will just echo our chair lady. I steal every idea I can from Mr. Garner and Mr. Parrott. So it's really great. Thank you so much for helping us sort through these issues. And we're going to be calling upon you in the future, I'm sure. Thank you.
Okay, good.
And I was late because I was at a funeral. I am sorry. I didn't hear everything, but I got the gist of it.
And we still have a big docket left in the day. So I will introduce the next panel and then gladly pass the mantle to our chair, who is far more capable of leading the discussion than me. But let me begin with the introductions. Deyanira Del Rio is the co-executive director of New Economy Project, a New York City-based organization that works with community groups to build an economy that works for all, rooted in racial and gender justice, neighborhood equity, and ecological sustainability. Damon Drummer is the managing director of equitable economy at PolicyLink. Before joining the PolicyLink team, he was the co-founder and executive director of New Consensus, a think tank advancing ideas to jumpstart an equitable economy. And I got to give a shout out because he does a lot of work with our institute as well. So I'm especially glad to have my friend Damon join us. And then Denise Scott has led the programs and operations of LISC efforts nationally across 38 states over the last 6 years. She also leads LISC National Housing, Health, Safety and Justice, and Sports and Recreation programs. And then we have Gregg Bishop, who is the executive director of the Social Justice Fund, which centers its work around racial justice and economic mobility for BIPOC populations in Brooklyn. From 2015 to 2020, he served as the commissioner of the New York City Department of Small Business Services. So we have an outstanding lineup, and we will begin with Deyanira Del Rio to set us off.
Commissioner, if I may, just before you begin, just acknowledge, you may not be aware that also joining us is Commission Member Fred Davey. He's on a train coming from DC where he was working, and so he's with us. And I just want everybody to know that. You didn't know that. I just want everybody to know. I'm sorry. Forgive me.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and good afternoon, commissioners. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you today on behalf of New Economy Project. I also want to thank the staff for organizing the event, and to the interpreters, to whom I apologize if I speak too quickly. But I wanted to just share a little bit of background about our organization and then share two ideas that we believe are bold, transformative, and urgently needed in our city. And one of them is public banking. So I want to also thank Dr. Parrott for that great segue from the last panel. So our organization, New Economy Project, is a citywide group that works with community-based organizations as well as low-income New Yorkers to build an economy that works for all and rooted in racial and gender equity, cooperation, and ecological sustainability. For the past 26 years, we've worked with groups throughout the city to combat persistent redlining, predatory lending, abusive debt collection, and other inequities in our financial system and economy that harm neighborhoods and that perpetuate racial wealth inequality. And we simply cannot talk about strategies to create wealth without addressing this ongoing systematic extraction of wealth from people in communities of color that is perpetuated by our current system. We work also with groups on affirmative and community-driven solutions to build wealth and to democratize control over land and housing, as well as finance, renewable energy, and other sectors of our economy. So again, we want to appreciate the Commission's invitation to present bold and transformational ideas, which is what we really try to challenge ourselves and with our coalitions to do. And again, I want to focus on public banking, and the second idea will be community land trust that I know you've heard a little bit about. I'm going to touch briefly on that. I want to underscore that both public banking and community land trusts are part of strong and growing, as many of you know, local movements for cooperative economics and community wealth building. And we believe that these values, that these approaches must be at the heart of any approach New York City takes to tackling racial wealth inequality and to advancing a just recovery. So in terms of public banking, we are part of a broad city-wide coalition as well as a statewide coalition that's advocating for public banking in New York. We believe the city should create what would be the country's first municipal public bank to address racial disparities with respect to capital access that were discussed in the previous panel, and to serve as an engine, again, for equitable and community-controlled development. Public banks are talked about in many ways. We're talking about public banks specifically as financial institutions that are created by a city or a county or a state, in this case by the city of New York, that would hold public deposits, our public money, and be chartered specifically to serve the public interest. So right now, the city's money, including the almost $100 billion budget that was just approved, is held by banks that have long redlined New York City neighborhoods of color, that fueled the subprime lending and foreclosure crisis more than a decade ago, and because of which many communities are still reeling. Banks that are financing real estate speculation and evictions, even as they continue to deny equal access to credit to people who live in those neighborhoods, that finance fossil fuel extraction and other industries that not only harm our city, our communities, but run counter to our city's values. With a public bank, New York City could divest public money from those Wall Street banks and invest instead in equitable economic development in our city, including truly affordable and desperately needed affordable housing, small and worker-owned businesses, including MWBEs, community-owned and other renewable energy infrastructure, and other needs. A public bank would also expand equitable access to capital in neighborhoods throughout the city by partnering with community-based and cooperative lenders. These include U.S. Treasury certified community development financial institutions and minority depository institutions that serve historically redlined neighborhoods, not only with retail branches and services for low income and immigrant and other New Yorkers, but that also provide loans for small business startup and expansion to create jobs, that finance truly affordable and permanently affordable housing, community facilities, and much more. New York City is home to a very strong network of CDFI credit unions, which are financial cooperatives and which are active members in our coalition and campaign for public banking. These are also the lenders that were at the forefront of getting federal PPP money out to small businesses, very small businesses in the pandemic, and that finance limited equity housing cooperatives that are some of the only affordable, represent some of the only affordable homeownership opportunities in the city. So we are, with our coalitions, advancing local and state legislation to pave the way for creation of public banks that would include strong public transparency, accountability, and governance structures. And there's broad-based support for this effort, including more than 100 groups statewide, a number of city council members, 65 state legislators. And in addition to the state proposal, which would create a new charter and framework for public banks. We are advancing local bills that would pave the way for formation of the country's first municipal bank. So we'll look forward to talking about that a little more. And I wanted to just quickly touch on community land trusts, which in previous sessions, you and previous panels have talked about in the context of advancing racial equity in housing and land use. So we're a founding member and coordinator of a citywide coalition, the New York City Community Land Initiative, that has helped to foster the growth of our local CLT movement from one fully operational Cooper Square Community Land Trust a few years ago to more than 15 now that are organizing across the 5 boroughs in Black, Brown, and immigrant neighborhoods. We coordinate a city council funding initiative that I know others have spoken about as well that has provided crucial funding, including $1.5 million in the new budget for CLT organizing. So as you've heard, the benefits of community land trusts include ensuring permanently affordable housing and preserving public subsidy in housing, but also giving communities meaningful control over land and development in their neighborhoods. So New York City community land trusts are taking root in neighborhoods that have been hardest hit by the pandemic and also by decades of redlining, followed by predatory investment and much more, and are experiencing very high rates of displacement and speculation. So one way that the city and this commission could strengthen CLTs and their impact is to prioritize community land trusts and other community-based nonprofits in the disposition of public land. And this could be achieved through charter changes that we and our coalition partners have been exploring that would prohibit the disposition of public land to for-profits unless there is no qualified CLT or other local organization that would be able to develop that property. And we want to underscore that we're advocating for this change not only for affordable housing, but also for non-housing uses. Community land trusts are best known for their ability to preserve deeply and permanently affordable housing, but they're also about much more. They're about community control over development and meeting a whole range of needs. And in the city, there's a range of groups that are pursuing CLTs also to keep small businesses in their communities, to develop community solar gardens and other infrastructure to make sure that arts and health spaces can stay in their communities. And so this change that we're proposing to the charter would engage, many agencies within the city, and we would look to for this change to cut across the different agencies and make sure that CLTs can achieve their full holistic mission. Aside from charter changes, there are other policies like the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, the abolition of the tax lien sale, and much more that would create additional opportunities for CLTs to take land and housing out of the speculative market and bring it under democratic community control. So I will pause there and look forward to the discussion.
Damon?
Yes, I'll jump in here. And thank you to the commission for the invitation to present to you briefly and join this panel. It's a very impressive lineup, and I'm reporting here from Chicago. I'm a fan of your work, and I appreciate the leadership that the commission is showing in the national stage, even as you do work in the city of New York. Again, I'm Damon Drummer, Managing Director for Equitable Economy at PolicyLink. PolicyLink is a national research and action institute advancing racial and economic equity by lifting up what works. And by equity, we mean just and fair inclusion in a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And we're working to ensure that all people in America, particularly those who face structural racism, participate in a just society, live in a healthy and vibrant community of opportunity, and prosper in an equitable economy. And we focus on advancing policies that will lift up the 100 million people living near or in poverty. The majority of those, of course, are people of color. And I'm here just to provide a frame and to echo what I'm hearing already on the panel, what's been pretty much a theme for today, public banking. But, I want to talk about briefly money, because I think it's impossible to talk about racial equity without talking about money. And we know, money has no intrinsic value. It's simply a tool to get resources, nourishment, shelter, It can mean security and safety in some cases, also for acquiring recreation. But money in this society in particular is a tool of gaining freedom. And when people don't have the money they need to move in the way they need to move on behalf of themselves and their families, we can't call those people free. And so it's impossible to talk about equity without talking about money, particularly the equitable creation, allocation, and circulation of money in our economy. And again, money is a means of mobilizing resources to achieve specific purposes. And money can also be understood as a measure of the people and places and purposes that we value in our society. And so when people are not paid for certain types of work, like care work, not only are we showing that our society does not value those people, we don't value those that type of work as well. And we don't value that benefit and that purpose. And when there are neighborhoods and communities in New York that don't receive the inflows of the money required, either through incomes or investment, we see that those neighborhoods are not valued by society. And, and again, this is the case all across this country. And so money is a means of mobilizing resources. It's also a measure of what we value in our society. And so if it's impossible to talk about equity without talking about money, it's impossible to talk about money without talking about government, particularly federal government, because everybody on this call knows that money is, in its most technical definition, and I'm not an economist, but its technical definition, it's a public good. It is a tool created by the public, by our government, an expression of we the people. It's ours. It is a public good. Our government creates all of our money. There's no such thing as private money. And so our government also allocates all money within our economy, either directly through federal spending or indirectly through the financial sector, primarily lending. And just to be clear, as my co-panelist here, Deyanira, mentioned, banks create money by lending. They are delegated that authority by government to serve that function. And when private banks cannot serve that function, we see an equity mandate to explore actively the possibility and the promise of public banking. And lastly, not only does government create all money, and not only does government ultimately allocate all money through that delegated authority to the banking sector, but also directly to federal spending, government also guides how money circulates through our economy through a combination of subsidies, taxes, and regulation. And so when we haven't raised the minimum wage in decades, and let's be clear, it's been raised, sure, but it's not enough. When the minimum wage has not kept up with the price of inflation, when somehow it is legal and okay to pay workers a wage that is well below productivity, where at this point, if wages kept on pace with productivity, they would be double, right? The median wage would be double what it is now. That's a regulatory question. So through subsidy, taxation, and regulation, government also controls and guides how money circulates through our economy. And just a quick example, the average working class New Yorker pays more in taxes, right, from a percentage basis than the richest New Yorkers. That's just a fact. So what we're saying is we're moving that money out of circulation from the working poor and allowing money that goes to the rich to stay in their pockets. And that's just not an equitable economy. And so again, money is a public good. Government, particularly federal government, creates all money, allocates all money, and ultimately guides how money circulates. Now, I'm not sharing anything you don't already know, but I'm just offering this frame for this conversation and for the record on this conversation. So what does this mean for New York as I come to the close of my remarks? One, this commission might consider establishing the purpose of city government as building an equitable city and being very clear about the role that local government plays in shaping a local economy, and being clear about the role that local government can play in informing and influencing federal policy as well, and naming that in the charter at some level. Two, and I want to add to, we don't have, there are many people leading on this matter, but obviously there is an opportunity to establish a public bank with a specific mandate to advance equity, economic and racial equity. That's clear. And so it's good to hear that is already in the conversation. And lastly, and I say this as a resident of Chicago who does not live in New York, who visits and loves the city, loves to visit, but I look around and I see that New York has a lot of problems as well. As the foremost city in this country, New York City as an institution, as the government itself can be positioned as an advocate for federal policy in solidarity with cities across the country. So what does it mean for the New York City Office of Intergovernmental Relations to be a champion of economic and racial equity? And so I'll conclude my remarks there, and I look forward to the conversation that's to come.
Thank you, Damon. Denise?
Okay, just unmuting. Hi, happy to be here with everyone, and I totally appreciate all of the conversation I've heard up to now. And I just wanted, so I'm with LISC. I run the national program agenda for LISC across the country, and I want to give a shout out to Valerie White, who is our executive director here in New York. So many of you know who she is. Just want to let you know she's in the audience. So nationally, as a CDFI, LISC has been involved in deploying significant capital into many of the communities that we're talking about today. The idea that our work should focus on investment-wise, programmatic-wise, and helping to eliminate race, health, and wealth and opportunity gaps in every way that we deploy money. When we think about the work that LISC is doing over the last couple of years, we're deploying somewhere around $2 billion a year. And the question for LISC as a CDFI and all of the other CDFIs and where the charter can be helpful is in our ability to be more intentional with a focus that is about systemic changes in the way in which capital is deployed. So this diversity agenda, which everybody now claims to have, what it may not have and where the charter can help us is that intentionality and the commitment. And it may be that we have to become more unapologetic about setting goals because without those benchmarks and our ability to kind of set goals and measure ourselves along the way, we won't, you got to know where you want to get to in order to get there. And so we tend to shy away from that sort of thing. And it's important to have some real benchmarks. Capacity may be limited in many of the communities that we're serving and that we're trying to deploy capital in, but that can't be an excuse for maintaining the status quo, which it often is. The idea is that, and this, I heard a little bit about the discussion around what prevents capital from flowing in a more equitable way. And oftentimes it happens in the credit committee where decisions cannot be made in favor of communities of color because of the readiness to receive capital. So that's an area that needs a particular focus. Some specifics on where we think the charter revision might be able to facilitate this diversity agenda and goal to eliminate racial barriers and access to capital and other opportunities with the city in support of community and economic development. First, the capital budget should include provisions to assure that BIPOC developers and real estate firms are proportionately hired for capital projects. The city can support the growth of these businesses by providing, in addition to access to contracts, capital for development and capacity building to help grow the businesses, and specifically focusing in on investment, liquidity, and equity dollars. Secondly, altering the procurement guidelines to take a much deeper look at procurement processes for MBEs with the express goal of increasing access to contracts so that MBEs receive more and larger contracts. And the city will need to push the state to allow MBEs to do non-competitive procurement at higher dollar amounts It's relatively low now. It probably should be somewhere upwards of $1 million. It's nowhere near there. Opportunities for MBEs can't be thought of in one-off situations. You can't grow your business if you can't count on regular stream of activity, whether you're a real estate developer or other kinds of businesses. And so the notion that pipeline of opportunities has to be the consideration, and that should be built into the language. The city should also tie the work that it does to a more diversity and equity agenda that includes who the city does business with. And this may have been stated before, but this could include and should include lawyers, auditors, insurance companies, contractors, and many more. Very specific language about making sure that this pool of partners with the city is also very, very diverse. In terms of regulations that govern city-owned property, we should consider revising provisions that would enable BIPOC developers to have priority access to purchase city-owned property, and then also consider committing a portion of tax lien property sales to BIPOC first-time home buyers to consider increases in homeownership opportunities. On zoning, bonuses should be given to development plans that ensure that marginalized communities have equitable access to community and supportive services. And the city has to do something about it, and the charter can help this along, placing less environmentally questionable facilities and structures in communities of color. On the safety front, the charter could include provisions to reinstate community policing, add a directive to begin developing law enforcement career paths for BIPOC youth, such as through specialized high schools, partnerships with CUNY, and there's a lot to say about the Civilian Complaint Board, but I'll focus on, and that it needs to be more representative of the communities that are largely engaged. The Human Rights Commission should take a more proactive role in addressing systemic inequities in the delivery of services by the city, including appointing special counsel on subjects such as digital equity infrastructure and the taking of real property away from BIPOC owners. So that whole taking process is a thing that takes away equity, or in many cases, people are losing their homes through a process that needs a reconsideration, and the charter needs to focus on that. And then finally, without going into a ton of detail, there's a lot to be said more on the housing front, but the city should make sure that equitable housing transactions follow fair housing regs and are happening consistently across the system. And then I would say that perhaps connected within the commission, but somewhere in the charter process, the government is really focused on removing barriers. In banking, we talked about equity in banking, but in insurance and appraisals, because that is where a lot of the devaluation is also taking place. And finally, I'll just conclude by saying a strong diversity agenda is by design disruptive, and therefore that it may not be politically often comfortable, but that if it's not disruptive, it's probably not addressing the systemic changes that are necessary. So I'll stop there, and happy to take other questions as we go on. Thank you.
Then is Gregg Bishop. Is Gregg here with us?
Gregg is on the way. I think we can go into Q&A for the time being. He'll be here shortly.
Okay, so let's go directly into Q&A. Well, I also want to thank the experts for those remarks that were very enlightening and in earnest motivating of what we actually can do proactively to secure greater economic security. Any commissioner want to lead us off with a question? Commissioner Thompson.
Hi.
really wonderful to see you all, and especially Denise, who I really miss. We worked together closely during the Dinkins administration, so it's great to see you.
Thank you.
I had a general question and then a more specific one. The general question for any of the panelists is, what other things besides banking do you all think the city should consider being public? So for example, Denise mentioned digital infrastructure. Given our experience in the pandemic and the problem of large swaths of our city not having internet access and the sort of kind of fundamental importance of it for getting a job or even going to class or other things, do you think that should be, the city should consider owning and controlling its own broadband internet infrastructure? Similarly, should the city provide property insurance to residents of the city the way public housing authorities actually are self-insured? Should the city pursue strategies like that, particularly when the city is kind of the main factor that makes sure property is well maintained and preserved? Would that be a way of actually steering more capital and more control towards the public? Is that a good or a bad idea? So that's a general kind of questions. What other things do you think should be publicly owned or at least considered? And more specifically, on the question of banking, why wouldn't we not ask the Federal Reserve to give the city or some institution of the city the same privileges that private banks have, which is you get zero or very low interest loans just by providing collateral, and then you reloan that money? I mean, that's what private banks do. Why couldn't the feds capitalize a city municipal bank overnight with a policy change like that? Why wouldn't that be a strategy towards that goal? So those are my questions.
And just as a point of information, Gregg Bishop has joined us, so please do answer the question, and then we'll pivot back to Gregg and then rejoin the Q&A after you all have thoroughly answered Commissioner Thompson's question.
Well, I'll say that as it relates to banking, insurance companies, appraisal companies, digital infrastructure, at a minimum, the city has to raise the bar for the partnership. And so whether we move to ownership, although self-insurance and city ownership of banking and a host of ideas like that are definitely worth exploring. But at a minimum, it shouldn't be a free pass. To some degree, these partnerships have minimal standards to them. And the goals of diversity and equity and inclusion and justice should be a part of the equation. So whatever the covenants are that govern the partnerships, when RFPs are issued for participation of lenders or insurance companies or auditors, all of those types of partnerships should have at a minimum the goals that are furthering the city's diversity agenda. And yeah, I think it is worth exploring what are the ownership opportunities for some of these, for some of these things. As far as the Federal Reserve Board goes, I obviously chair the New York board. I don't set the policy, but what I would agree that that there's a lot more players, including CDFIs, that should have a bigger role. A special permission was given during the PPP program for CDFIs to participate, but only a few were actually able to. And so I think looking into, and the Board of Governors for the Fed has heard this conversation. So I think continuing to press on the conversation about how to capitalize government. It would have made it a lot easier while we were waiting for the stimulus to come through if the capital were more directly available as it was and currently is for banks. So I think it's a conversation that would have to go up to the Board of Governors for further conversation. Maybe it's the Conference of Mayors that brings it to the Board of Governors for a conversation.
I'll just jump in quickly and say thanks for the question. And, I think one of the reasons that we and our coalition partners around the city and state are getting behind public banking is because of its flexibility to do its own direct lending and investment, but also to partner with on the ground CDFIs that already exist. So it's taking advantage of existing infrastructure, existing knowledge, existing underwriting and other capacity. So these are institutions that have decades of proven experience. They have the track record. They are serving the very people and neighborhoods that the banks not only refuse to serve, but when they do manage to get into the bank branch, the banks are actively extracting overdraft fees and every kind of nickel and dime they can from people and actually expelling them from the system. So these are, trusted, often cooperative, nonprofit, mission-driven institutions that know how to serve their neighborhoods. They know how to assess needs, not just looking at numbers like a credit score or not, shying away from, so-called riskier ventures like worker cooperatives where there isn't one person to hold accountable if the loan fails. But what they don't have, because they are serving low-income neighborhoods, they don't have access to capital at the scale that their neighborhoods need. And so that's where a public bank would step in as a partner bank, helping to finance the credit and investment needs that these local institutions can identify best. The other thing I wanted to mention is that at the federal level, one proposal that is very intriguing and will be transformative is a federal public banking act that Representatives Ocasio-Cortez and Tlaib have proposed. And it's very similar to the state bill that we're proposing. But what that bill would do is create different frameworks of support for state and local public banks. And one of those things would be access to the Federal Reserve, as well as other, other resources that would help public banks be able to grow and meet the needs in their local communities.
And I'll add just briefly to the comments. I mean, I don't need to add anything to this, but I'll just add that insofar as we can build in equity and accountability into the structures, I think we'd be hard pressed not to extend the idea of public ownership over even a broader range of activities, including energy, at least a public option. And so I think particularly the city of New York has a lot to think about in that regard. I mean, in Chicago, we were always told we couldn't do publicly owned broadband because we don't have the density of New York. So New York seems like it has very few outs to not explore these types of options. So yes, I think public options that have built-in accountability and equity, that's the way to go.
All right, thank you. Executive Director Bishop, please take the floor.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And I know I'm happy to be here. I know we need to keep it brief, so it's good to see everyone. Deputy Mayor Thompson, it's good to see you. I have just some brief comments in my testimony, and then I'm not sure what the format is. I'm happy to take any questions. But my focus is really, for those who don't know, I'm now the Executive Director of the Social Justice Fund, and we focus on racial equity and economic mobility, racial justice and economic mobility, particularly in Brooklyn. In my 13 years in the city, one of the things that I'm focused on is really how, using this commission, we can create the legal infrastructure to address some of the things that even Deputy Mayor Thompson has talked about. So I'm just going to read this really quickly to keep me on time, and then happy to then take any questions. So I think I'm preaching to the choir in terms of everyone understanding that numerous studies have painted a bleak picture for wealth creation for Black Americans. I think Deputy Mayor Thompson has talked about this at many events that I've been at, and we all know that the household has the ability to create wealth that has the ability to generate wealth. Structural issues such as health, wellness, housing are all addressed, and we saw that with COVID. and the impact COVID has had on the Black community. We also know that there are many tools for wealth creation, which includes education, real estate, entrepreneurship, and generational transfer of wealth. In each of these categories, we see systemic challenges for Black individuals, including well-documented segregated education system in New York City, a housing crisis that goes back generations to redlining of specific communities in New York City, and the destruction of Black communities. Seneca Village is just a number, a Mwbes project by Robert Moses, and the undervaluing of property in majority Black communities, which we could talk about ad nauseam. In New York City, we know that the Black community represents over 20% of, about 24% of the total population, but only represent 2% of total businesses. And we also know that Black individuals, and I think we talked about this, I just came into the conversation, are 50% less likely to get the right size capital from a lender to operate their business. And many studies have shown that Black individuals also lack the social capital necessary to raise seed funding to start a business. So I'm painting the picture because, layered on top of the impact of Jim Crow segregation, the median net worth of households with Black college graduates in their 30s have plunged over the past 3 decades to less than 1/10 the net worth of their white counterparts, according to a recent Federal Reserve study. So what I'm suggesting is that New York City should declare economic mobility as a health crisis. Using this declaration in the charter would help the city create targeted programs specifically for Black New Yorkers, similar to what we have seen with like HUD opportunity zones. As we know, New York City government is prohibited from using public dollars to further social policy unless it's specific and it's authorized by the state. However, by declaring a public health crisis, the city is then allowed to fund specific programs to address the numerous issues I just laid out. In particular, the city can use this declaration to work with the Economic Development Corporation to fund capital programs that have more favorable terms to help spur entrepreneurship in communities that are identified by this declaration. We also know from studies that supporting Black-owned businesses lead to job creation in Black communities, and therefore the jobs improve the quality of living, which impacts health, education, and even crime. A declaration would also transform the city's procurement process by allowing the city, and Deputy Mayor Thompson, you talked about this, and so should sound familiar, to focus on evaluating the best value for the city. Therefore, an analysis can be done that justifies paying more for a product if it supports a Black-owned business that could lead to other benefits such as lower employment and crime in a community. Instead of the lowest bid, this analysis could be used instead. It should also assist with making CUNY free for students in areas identified by this declaration, which would help build skills that are in demand in those communities, leading to greater workforce participation. And the focus should be intentional and would need an attorney, because I'm not one, so I'm just putting it out there, to craft the right language. But the data is clear. If we do nothing, Black Americans' percentage of wealth will decline to match our wealth during slavery. This is obviously unacceptable. So thank you for your time, and look forward to seeing the results of the commission.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes or so if we want to get our bathroom break in, but please do ask questions, and let's follow up on some of the points that were raised in the panel discussion.
I'll jump in. And first, I just want to express my appreciation to all of you again for participating in this discussion. And as Commissioner Hamilton said to the last panel, some of you may have heard, I request at this moment the opportunity to come back to the well and lean in as we develop these proposals. As I listen to you, appreciating all that you've shared and nodding my head in agreement, I also find myself trying to figure out how this translates into proposals to be put before the voting public. And so, just to put it plainly, we want to do all that we can and have it be all that it needs to be. Just as we're centering on economic equity, we're looking at education equity, health equity, environmental equity, housing, the list goes on, right? Neighborhood equity. And maybe I carry this burden in ways that I shouldn't, or maybe I go places where I shouldn't initially. But I just keep on coming back to how do we ensure through a finite set of proposals that we are addressing the underlying issue that helps to make, if we can't put forth every recommendation, because the voting public may not pick it up. At the core, what is it that you recommend to us that will move the needle? If we can, and I'm not saying that we're tossing anything that you said aside, so please don't hear that. But at the core, what will move the needle? If it's 3 or 4 things, and it's not policy per se or institutional, what will move the needle in addressing economic inequity?
And just as a time check, I just want to mention that in the queue, we have Commissioner Garrido, Commissioner Kwai, and then Commissioner Thompson has his hand up. And we have about maybe 10 minutes of time left in the session.
And let me just say, we can move on from the question that I'm positing because it may be something that requires further thought. And I'm fine with that. But I'm just presenting it as an ever-present concern in each of these cases. So if you want to move on and we can come back to the well, I'm fine with that.
Can I answer like 30 seconds?
Sure.
Okay. I do think that there's not time to get into the specifics, but there are, in some of what I presented, there are very specific charter changes, for example, in terms of actually directing land, housing, other property to communities for real meaningful oversight and control. There's clear ability in the charter to do that. And that will take advantage of the growing landscape of community land trusts and other community-based institutions that are organizations that are looking at CLTs and land ownership with a reparations framework and thinking about how land can be foundational for so much other development that addresses ecological sustainability and creates jobs and living wage jobs and much more. So I think that that's one thing. And on the public banking front, it's a little more complicated. We would love to have a follow-up conversation with you all to dig into the specifics of that, but we also believe that that is a transformational approach because it is taking the power of New York City's finances and having some control over it, which New York City has none of right now. Whereas you or I can choose where we put our money. We can, take our money out of the big banks, put in our local credit unions. The city is handcuffed to Wall Street banks, and the banks have lobbied to keep it that way. So creating a public bank would radically change that and give the city a powerful new tool to promote equitable development, including to advance racial justice.
I would just add that anything that's really focused on access to capital, it's key, and ownership is key. So those are the 2 boxes that you probably want to center on, but there's also a third area, which is that does not necessarily require a charter change, but it's policy. And so there are different avenues to pursue by way of this is the city's policy and how it does business that may not necessarily be reflected in a charter change, but could become a way in which government is operating. And I'm happy to talk more with you about any of those ideas.
All right, and we'll move on, but I appreciate what you're saying. We'll come back to the well, but Mr. Sherman, I think we also need to lean in and hear more from you at a later point in time about work and evaluating work and wages. So I just want to come back. Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Garrido, sir.
Thank you. A question is for the panel. Thank you very much. I'll be brief. Several discussions have talked about the creation of an entity, whatever that entity looks like, that will look for equity and inclusion. Do you believe, to the comments that Deyanira mentioned, that if we were to create an entity that would overlap in some of these ideas, whether it's access to capital or community ownership, a land trust, or some of the functions, that there will be enough of a portfolio to overlap with city agencies within the charter? Or is that going into federal la la land? I call federal la la land these rules that in banking and financing that tend to be so stupid at sometimes that you just don't make any sense out of it. And if so, where do we draw the line?
And Commissioner, can you restate? I want to make sure I understand the question. I think it's a really good question. Just if you could restate it.
So just for the record, we've been having several discussions about the possibility of creating an entity, right? An agency that would be for community planning of some sort, right? There's been different ideas of what that entity would look like. But if we envision the creation of an entity who looks at some of the in their portfolio, some of the ideas that have been suggested today, like access to capital and community ownership, right? Land trust and different things. And then the key of federal banking regulation being at the core of that access to capital, would that be sort of a bridge too far in terms of what the city charter does right now vis-a-vis federal red state regulations? I hope that's clear.
I don't believe so. I think the city can be aggressive in setting the mandate of whatever entity is set up, which would automatically exist within the broader kind of regulatory structure of banking. But whatever powers can be brought down to the municipal level or into the, not to the municipal level, into the city itself can be leveraged with all existing current laws with very few reforms, right? And so if the goal is to have the city have the power to engage in that space, then the answer is the city has a lot of room to operate, if that's clear.
Yeah, let me just rephrase this. My question maybe could be easier reframed by saying, will these ideas that you're proposing require state and federal legislation?
Some of
maybe
them,
that's what I'm getting at.
some of it will, along with federal, the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve, the federal government, and the state, depending upon what they are. It's more, some of what I heard today and what I said goes outside of the boundaries of the charter's purview. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider it, because we're saying that systemic change is necessary.
Yeah, and just to clarify, at least on public banking, we believe the city has authority to create a public bank now, but the existing state charter framework doesn't really, it's not created with a public bank in mind, right? It's for, private shareholder controlled banks. So we're advocating for state legislation, and that's what I was saying has broad, strong state support, 65 co-sponsors, 100 groups advocating for it. It would be a huge help if the city got behind that, but that's a framework that would be specific to public banks, have transparency provisions, make sure the governance is sound, that there's no political interference, for example. So that framework would facilitate and preempt any legal challenges, we believe, to the creation of a public bank, which is why we're advocating for it. Then it would be subject to certain federal rules, but there's no federal legislation needed to create the public bank. So it's well within the jurisdiction.
Commissioner Quad? Oops, muted.
We able to unmute him?
Chris, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yeah, my question is about along that line, for the Rio and then also John, in terms of what is the main barrier right now in terms of setting up a public bank? I mean, is it like some kind of ideological barrier, or like what is the power structure right now? Is like, are they against it? Because I think that my understanding is that actually during the COVID-19, the Federal Reserve actually has developed a program where the city and state could actually access a tremendous amount of capital by pledging asset. And it's just that I think that there's very few city or state has taken advantage of that program. And so what is the main barrier for creating a public bank?
Yeah, that's my understanding also. It was a little bit different. It was for sort of cities for cash flow, the municipal credit facility. So it's a little different than I think what Commissioner Thompson mentioned. but point taken. I think that public banking is a new concept here in this country. So there's a bit of a imagination failure at times. I think it's a political will question. I think public banking is common throughout the world. We're the anomaly. So I think that, we have a local example in the State Bank of North Dakota, and we have a lot of others that are working to create the next generation of public banks, and they're going to happen. I think it's inevitable. And so it's really in the cities and states' interest to create frameworks that are going to be appropriate and safe and transparent, that are going to align with the other public policy goals of the city to advance it. But we do think there's the capacity and financial skill set in this city. It exists. And it's really political will.
And I'm going to ask there might be other responses from the panelists to that question as well. But I'm going to ask that Commissioners Thompson and Commissioner Yu ask their questions together simultaneously, and then we get a response in the interest of time. Commissioner Thompson.
Okay. First, thanks, Gregg, for mentioning emergency powers. I actually had forgotten about that. That is something Rudy Giuliani actually tried to put in the empowerment zone proposal from Harlem in the 90s. He said unemployment is a citywide emergency, therefore the city can use its police power to void procurement laws and give priority to Harlem-based businesses for city contracts. So, I mean, that is something to look into. Thank you for raising that. I have a comment and a question, I guess. But first, on public banking, I also know, I think Ms. Del Rio is right, like Japan has public banks, lots of people have public banks. Europe also has private, quote unquote, private banks that we would consider very similar to nonprofits, like Triodos, which is a green bank in the Netherlands, which is basically community and advocacy and stakeholder owned. It's a lot like our CDFIs. So there also are those kinds of things that are possible. But my main question is this. I read a book by an economic historian, Canadian, Leo Panich, I think his name is, died recently. And he said, how did globalization happen? And he mentioned that the US Treasury Department and Treasury Departments of the main European countries met in the 1960s once every 6 weeks for 10 years and literally came up with legislation, with a whole program around how to standardize global banking and finance. And that's what made globalization possible. Their ability to move capital across countries, to enable businesses to become multinationals, all of that, with property rights standardized. They met every 6 weeks for 10 years. And what that made me think of, this conversation and the other conversations we've had by expert panels are so rich. And we have learned so much in the last 30 years since Denise and I were like, trying to find the bathroom in City Hall, and learn how things work. We've learned so much. We don't come together, though, to actually tap all this knowledge to say, how do we use it to advance people of color in New York and elsewhere? And I just find this such a valuable set of conversations. My question is, how do you think we can structure some way to have this kind of engagement on an ongoing basis? Because whether we're talking about public banking or insurance or whatever, it's not a one-off quick soundbite conversation. How do we actually use the city to help create infrastructure so that we can actually do this kind of work together long-term? So in a way that we can actually follow through the way that the banks did in the 60s. How do we do that? That's a question. And I guess it's an augment to what Commissioner Garrido has been raising over. How do we actually create a way of sustaining this kind of stuff, this kind of thinking, development, et cetera, ourselves?
One thing that's going to be
I'm
necessary.
going to ask us to hold on for a second to get Commissioner Yu's question in, and then we'll give everybody a chance to respond.
Hi, I'm just here really, I turned on my camera because I wanted to say hi to Gregg and to my friend Day and my colleagues, and to Denise that I've met many, many years ago. And it's so great to see here. My question has to do with public banking. I think this is like the hot topic today. But there are all these different models of financing that communities and immigrant communities that haven't had access to banking, community lending pools and things like that. As we talk about public banking, are there those models that we can incorporate? And have you seen an effective incorporation of some of those models? This is what I've talked about when I need to geek out at some point and feel really smart. This is what I talk about with Deputy Mayor Thompson, just being transparent. But Day, I would love to hear if you have seen any models.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. We're going to be holding an event in September. I'll make sure everyone here gets that information, where we're going to be profiling and having guests from the Global South present on their public bank models. And, I think that many of the public banks around the world, they look very different. Some of them do provide, individual and community facing services. They have branch networks. They, are in rural neighborhoods filling the gaps that their banking systems have left. But, in other cases, they're more following our model, where it's really more about a bank that would be a bank for the city and be kind of an infrastructure and a partnership bank for community-based lenders. So I think there's a real broad mix, but certainly it's a model that is flexible. And even within our state proposal, the framework is flexible enough so that if there are parts of the state that, for example, do not have strong CDFI networks like we have in the city, that Rochester and other places have, there could be a public option that a public bank could offer to individuals as well.
The CDFI network is a pretty significant infrastructure that I think more has to be done to capitalize this industry. And some of the barriers to lending and investing in communities exist for us that could be, we should be addressing. For example, getting capital to small minority businesses, getting through credit committee is no small thing. And the only way you get through credit committee is with some form of credit enhancement. So this calls to mind the philanthropic community as well that should be put on the table. And New York is certainly rich in philanthropic community that could step up, including the banks for their philanthropic side, to put credit enhancement where it's necessary in order to support more lending from among the institutions that were set up to provide financing to communities, low income and communities of color. The other thing I'll say, Phil, to your earlier point about how do we all come together, we have to come together to think about and to imagine how to rebuild this city. That we have a charge in front of us. The city is not going to be the same place that it was a year and a half or so ago. And there's a lot to be reconsidered about how to reuse property, how to deal with this question of access to capital, and a host of other things that I think the commission certainly should be, I think, convening for the purposes. It's under the banner of what should New York City look like and how should it function and how should it do business. If we could think post COVID, there is a new order for this city, and this is certainly a place where the discussion could be centered.
All right, so we.
So sorry, really quickly, I know we have to take a break, but to Deputy Mayor Thompson's question, I think there's the infrastructure already built into the city to convene conversations like this. You could look at Plan NYC, which I think is now like one NYC, but the city puts out a strategic plan for inclusive growth, which everything that we're talking about could be interpreted as that. Once the plan is out, I don't know who actually is the holder of that, which agency is the holder of that, or who checks in on the progress of that. So that is one way to incorporate what we're talking about here into the strategic planning of the city to ensure that every year there's some level of convening to monitor progress.
And if I could add just one last piece, I know you're trying to wrap up, but across the city, some of these, community wealth building, cooperative, solidarity economy initiatives and sectors like land trusts and worker co-ops, financial food co-ops, they're already collaborating on the ground, I think in more coherent and consistent ways than is reflected in terms of the city's policy making and its own interagency coordination. So this isn't fully answering the question, but I think that strengthening those conversations at the city level to mirror and engage on the ground groups that are practicing and developing these initiatives, and having giving those groups an opportunity to shape what city policy and support could look like, whether it's a task force or a new office of community wealth building or cooperative economics or whatever it could be. I think that would be also a really rich conversation.
Damon, did you have any thing you wanted to add?
I would just add very briefly, I do. So I would add very briefly, commissioners, we have already one of the most powerful network of public banks in the entire world. It is the Federal Reserve System. And so I think, it may not be within the boundaries of this charter, but I do think the Conference of Mayors, I think New York being very bold on that front and saying, hey, we have this capacity that's been reserved primarily for the financial sector, which happens to be based in New York. How do we unleash this capacity for the whole of the country and make it much more accessible and relevant to the real economy? And I just wanted to name that as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Technically, the Federal Reserve is a public bank, perhaps not acting in all the ways that we would desire. Also, I believe the state of North Dakota has a public bank, which again, might not be acting in all the capacities that we envision. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and just mention that I'm certainly a big fan of public banks, and a concern, though, that one might have when thinking about them very well might be that the state itself can be predatory, and the state can be remarkably efficient with regards to collection, and especially if we're doing direct lending in ways that the private sector isn't. So I do like the point that was raised earlier in this panel about a specific mandate for any type of public bank that would be initiated around equity and inclusion, so as to avoid some of those predatory influences that we've seen states engage in the past. All right, so we have, one, big gratitude to everyone, commissioners. We had a lot of information with a real short period of time, but we're going to take a quick break and then conclude with our third panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. So my co-partner in this endeavor, Commissioner Derek Hamilton, who who's been doing a tremendous job, is turning the reins over to me or passing the torch. I'd be more than fine with him staying in this space and leading this last panel and closing us out, but he's done yeoman's work, and so I'll pick it up from here, and at least I'll try not to embarrass you, Commissioner Hamilton. Our next panelists are here, and I'll take a quick moment to share with you a little bit about each of them. The first person who is here with us, I'll just give it to you in the order that's been presented to me. Rebecca Dixon, Executive Director of the National Employment Law Project. She's a respected national leader in federal workers' rights advocacy. She's worked diligently to improve the lives of low-income families and unemployed workers through public policy research, writing and advocacy, fundraising, and program development and leadership. During the Great Recession, Rebecca led her organization's Unemployment Insurance Modernization Campaign, which contributed to the expansion of UI eligibility to more than 200,000 workers in 20 states. In addition, she's managed the organization's Unemployment Insurance State Technical Assistance Project, which advises and supports more than 30 state partners. Lorelei Salas is a fellow with the Open Society Foundation's Leadership in Government Fellowship and a Fulbright specialist with expertise in U.S. consumer and worker protection laws. From 2016 to 2021, Salas served as the commissioner of the New York City Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. Previously, she was the legal director at Make the Road New York and led the legal department at Catholic Migration Services. In 2009, she was nominated by President Obama as the Wage and Hour Administrator at the United States Department of Labor. She also worked at the New York State Attorney General's Office in the Litigation and Labor Bureaus and held multiple senior managed positions at the New York State Department of Labor, supervising strategic enforcement efforts. Gonzalo Mercado Cisterna is the Director of Transnational Initiatives at National Day Labor Organizing Network. Gonzalo previously served as the Executive Director of El Centro, a storefront immigrant day labor center in Port Richmond, Staten Island. Through his work, Gonzalo came to understand the power of grassroots activism. And the fourth person to present to us this afternoon, I know her well and can't say enough great things about her. Arva Rice, President and CEO of the New York Urban League, an organization whose mission is to enable African Americans and other underserved communities to secure first-class education, economic self-reliance, and equal respect of civil rights through programs, services, and advocacy. I want to welcome you all to this panel. And the way that we've structured these conversations, as you may have heard if you were on the last panel or listening in, every panelist has 8 minutes to present, and then we will have a dialogue with the commissioners directly with you. So I will begin with Rebecca. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this important topic with you today. So I'll just jump right in. A just and inclusive economy is only achievable by centering racial equity. The fact that a disproportionate share of people in underpaid, insecure, and unsafe jobs are Black and brown is not inevitable, nor is it accidental. It was created by our policy choices, slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, to name a few, and the rationing of remuneration, rights, benefits, and protections, which is the focus of these remarks. Rationing implies that we are constrained by scarce resources, which fits with our economy that is built on the premise that 40% of jobs must pay poverty-level wages. Separate and unequal applies not just to schools and neighborhoods, but also to the labor market. After controlling for education, 87% of occupations in the United States can be classified as racially segregated, contributing to generational wage and wealth gaps. Occupational segregation is the preservation of glass and concrete ceilings and the shunting of women and people of color into low-paying, low-quality, often precarious occupations. The blacker the occupation, the lower the wages. The more female dominated, the more that work is undervalued, especially care work. New York is not immune to this labor market rationing. The jobs with the highest percentage of Black workers in New York State are low paying, with more than half paying less than $30,000 a year. In contrast, jobs with the highest percentage of white workers are paying higher paying occupations, with more than half paying $60,000 or more. But rationing doesn't just stop with wages. At NELP, we work to close wage and work gaps. And work gaps are the ways in which underpaid workers of color are treated differently with regards to the opportunity to join an organization, to move up within it, the ability to be paid accurately and on time, the ability to be safe at work with dependable jobs and schedules. So I will talk briefly about 4 work gaps and solutions for those. The first one is employment discrimination. A recent meta-analysis of hiring discrimination in field experiments found that hiring discrimination against African Americans has not decreased in the past 25 years. Using resumes and match pair testing, researchers found that on average, white job applicants receive 36% more callbacks than African Americans and 24% more callbacks than Latinos. Their results were durable, even when you account for education, gender, occupational grouping, and study method, and local labor market conditions. Today, many employers use algorithms and other technology-based methods to find workers, and some of this bakes in the existing discrimination. There is also an interconnection with the criminal justice system and its role in creating and maintaining a vulnerable population of workers who are expected to, and sometimes court-ordered, to accept any job under any conditions. Issue 2 is wage theft. Although New York is known for having strong worker protections, including a $15 minimum wage, paid family leave, wage theft still persists at epidemic levels. Wage theft occurs when employers cheat workers out of minimum wages and overtime pay and more. The Center for Popular Democracy has estimated that wage theft in New York State may impact 2.1 million workers, exceeding $3 billion annually. That's $3 billion that can't support families and communities. And as you could guess, this problem also is disproportionately impacts underpaid workers, immigrants, and workers of color. Issue 3 is precarious work. So worker health and safety has been at the forefront because of this pandemic, but some of these same workers are also working under precarious conditions. Black and Latinx workers are overrepresented in underpaid, insecure gig work available through apps and platforms. These workers are often misclassified as independent contractors, meaning they are in business for themselves when they're not, and that excludes them from nearly all workplace protections and benefits. The same workers are also overrepresented in temp and staffing jobs. For example, Latinx workers hold 17% of temp and staffing jobs, which is about 1.6 times higher than their level in the overall share of the workforce. In addition to the uncertainty about job duration, temp work often comes with a wage and benefit penalty. For example, temps can often earn 40% less working side by side with permanent employees who are doing the exact same job. So let's turn to solutions. And just to let you know, I'm treading carefully here because the city does have some good policies in place, and there is some concern about preemption, so whether the federal government or state government have authority on the issue. So for employment discrimination, the city has a new criminal records discrimination law as of July, and we urge that this enforcement comes with full discretionary use of penalties, affirmative audits, and investigations, so not just waiting for individuals to file complaints. We also urge the collaboration with community-based organizations, worker centers, unions, and others to help with the implementation. The Human Rights Commission has a broad mandate, and the laws are actually more expansive than the state and federal laws, which means that they should prioritize groups that are not covered already. So this would mean illegal to discriminate against interns, independent contractors, and also on the basis of things like caregiver status, credit history, salary history. For wage theft, here in New York City, again, one of the few places where the city actually can address this issue. So some improvements here could be stricter on enforcing wage theft and labor standards more generally via procurement standards, where only contracting with employers that are not actively engaging in wage theft. And there's a federal executive order that does the same. The Office of Policy and Labor Standards could do a more concerted enforcement audit and sweeps of home care and domestic work employers to avoid workers having to come forward individually. There's a big power differential there that often prevents workers from coming forward. This affirmative audit investigation can be done in a number of high violation industries and in collaborations with community groups, unions, and worker centers. The city could also enact one fair wage for tipped workers, and there may be some preemption issues here, so just to have that out there. And the Freelance Isn't Free Act covers all freelance workers and gig workers and requires timely payment of wages. So the city could actually go after gig employers under this statute. And finally, precarious work. We can improve job quality for workers in temp and staffing by ensuring that these workers all have access to higher wages, traditional employment rights, and bedrock benefits. And things like paid sick leave, paid family leave, and just cause dismissal, and that they are able to exercise their collective power by joining together in the workplace. And this would go a long way to eliminating the second tier status that these workers are currently dealing with in terms of benefits, rights, and protections. I think I'll wrap there and happy to take questions.
Thank you. Very, very much appreciate all that you shared. We will go through all of the panelists and then we'll do Q&A. And so the next person scheduled to speak, I think that is an indication of how long I've been going all day and what I've been doing. The next person to speak is Lorelei Salas. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to see all of you, and especially my former boss, Deputy Mayor / Commissioner Phil Thompson. And I'm really glad to follow after Rebecca, because a lot of the comments and ideas she has, I think, are very much on the same, I have kind of the same perspective on some of these issues. And I will be drawing on, in these remarks, on my experience working both at the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, but also in my years working for grassroots organizations like Make the Road New York and others. And so at the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, the mission to protect both workers and consumers is a mission that the staff take really to heart. And the agency has published a number of reports on both the financial health and well-being of New Yorkers, as well as the state of workers' rights in New York City year after year. So I encourage the commission to review these reports I submitted and forwarded some of the links to these publications. And so you can see what the city has been able to do so far and what the gaps are. So with that mission in mind, the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection examined the well-being of New Yorkers in a number of different ways. The agency studied the unbanked and underbanked populations in New York City, issued groundbreaking reports on student loan debt across different neighborhoods in New York City, and reported on how Black borrowers bear an unequal share of the student loan debt burden. So, and I believe that you probably have already discussed in detail the racial wealth gap, but just like a couple of numbers quickly on from the Center for American Progress. In 2019, the median wealth of Black households in the US was $24,000, compared with $189,000 for white households. And the typical Black household had 12.7% of the wealth of the typical white household. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in this country to bridge that gap. And there are a number of things that the city can do. And I have a couple of ideas, suggestions with regards to debt, with regards to income or wages. And lastly, just a couple of structural things on licensing. With regards to debt, the student loan debt crisis has had a disparate impact on communities of color in New York City. Over 1 million New Yorkers collectively owed close to $35 billion in debt before COVID, right? So the numbers are much bigger now. Research by the Office of Financial Empowerment shows that New Yorkers that are struggling to pay their debt, a significant number of them attended for-profit schools. Additionally, those who were in default of their loans, for them, the average debt was $5,000 or less, which does not seem high compared to the national average of about $25,000 to $30,000 in debt. But this debt poses significant barriers for these New Yorkers' path to building financial security. In fact, for many of these New Yorkers, the $5,000 of unpaid student loan debt means credit scores that are destroyed, wages that are garnished, and the inability to build assets. The city could design a program of student loan debt forgiveness targeting Black and Brown borrowers that attended for-profit schools in New York City and did not obtain their degrees or certificates, and that are willing to work with a city-funded financial counselor to rebuild their credits and to begin to build assets. The city can also consider imposing some consumer protection requirements on for-profit schools with respect to their representations and recruitment practices with prospective students, so that these students can better understand the value of the degree or certificate before they enroll and take out loans that they might never be able to repay. One program that I think merits special attention and that the city is already embracing is the New York City Kids Rise College Savings Program. And it is a program that allows for, and the mayor recently announced an expansion of this program where every kid in New York City public school will be able to get to open a New York State college savings account to begin building assets from kindergarten. It's a really amazing way to try to start getting at the issue of the racial wealth gap so that every kid can have an asset. And that will also help them in not having to take out as many loans as people have to do now to finance their educations. With respect to wages, incomes, Rebecca already mentioned the issue of wage theft, which is clearly, it's a crisis, right? And it is a problem that has become even worse during COVID. As you can imagine, many workers who were left out of the safety net, who did not qualify for unemployment insurance benefits, for instance, had to keep working, had to choose between either putting food on the table, right, and feeding their families, or maybe risk getting sick. Many of these workers were essential workers working at retail stores, retail establishments, fast food restaurants, typically industries that usually pay low wages and that offer few, if any, benefits, such as health insurance or retirement plans. And the city does have some strong laws, as Rebecca mentioned, especially during this administration, had put in place really strong protections that help workers get paid when they get sick, that help freelancers get paid when their companies that hire them don't pay them in time, and that protect workers who have often volatile schedules in the fast food and the retail industries. But the Office of Labor Policy and Standards has yet to be resourced to be able to enforce these laws. And as Rebecca mentioned, both the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection through its Office of Labor Standards and Policy and the City Commission on Human Rights are the agencies that would take complaints from workers in our city if they are discriminated at work or if they're not get paid fully according to the law. So, you know, it is really a great first step to put in place progressive laws, progressive legislation, but we now need to take the next step of making sure that these benefits become real for New Yorkers on the ground. And another thought on the wage theft problem is that, you know, there's certainly a division of authority, division of labor between the New York City enforcement agency and the state and the federal enforcement agencies, the departments of labor. But the city could partner and could have a formal delegation of authority from New York State, for instance, to be able to enforce state wage laws in New York City. This is a model that does not require legislation. It can be done administratively, and there are other contexts in which it's possible or it's already in place at the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. For instance, the city agency has been given the authority to enforce the tobacco laws, right? So you can have a similar model if both administrations are willing to work with each other. I know that I'm almost at the end of my remarks. So just one quick thing on our licenses and permits. I think that the city could institute a review of licensing and permitting schemes that make fingerprinting and criminal history reviews a routine part of the application. To the extent that the license and permits require these types of reviews, they should be narrowly limited and construed so as not to unfairly deprive Black and Brown individuals from business opportunities that these licenses and permits can bring. So I will stop there, but I look forward to engaging in the discussion at the end of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Gonzalo Mercado.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to address the commissioners and this commission that I really welcome to make sure that this is an opportunity to really reshape the future of our city. I really wanted to provide a couple of ideas and how do we, move towards this vision of equity, inclusion, and prosperity for everyone. I truly share many of the thoughts that have been shared by Rebecca, Lorelei, folks that we've known each other for many, many years and really have been trying to fight these issues for so long. My experience and advice comes from working with one of the most excluded workers in our city for the past 15 years, and also in one of the most segregated boroughs of our city. It's not a surprise that Staten Island is a different animal than anywhere else in the city, and I think that it should be given a special attention to the dynamics that occur in this borough, especially as it has to do with the role of government and who is included and who is not included, even at the table in these conversations. That in places like Staten Island can really be night and day. Who is at the table. On top of that, this pandemic has uncovered many of these inequities that we already knew. But now all New Yorkers know and understand the lifeline that immigrant workers and the immigrant workforce provides to us all. This is the exact moment we should be including the voices and ideas of the people and the workers most effective themselves and how to rebuild a fair and just city for all. Some concrete examples or recommendations I have. First is strengthening the enforcement of the current worker protections to ensure workers have a safe workplace and their wages are not only not stolen, but they're also living wages. And we have to understand that when we're talking about the wages of immigrant workers and what happens to them, if, for example, they want to bring a case over and not suffer retaliation or even be afraid of them facing deportation, which not only destabilizes neighborhoods and communities here in our own city, but sometimes halfway around the world as well, when that happens to an immigrant worker. So I know that we are a beacon and a model in terms of all the protections that we have, and I think there are more that we can have. But if these protections don't have an easable access and enforceable way of making sure that they are at the hand of folks and people are not going to be afraid of exercising their right, is something that we really need to look at. And another idea is to develop community innovation and inclusion spaces in neighborhoods with high levels of unemployment, poverty, so people in their own communities can articulate local solutions to the problems. We are so diverse geographically again, but also in different areas. I think there are sometimes solutions that might be happening at a very, very low scale with ideas, with folks coming together in a community garden or somewhere like that. They sometimes get lost, for government. And then if built on and with the experience of people who are so attached to their communities, really is that what is going to be provide transformative change. I do believe in the power of real community members who are vested in their community and government accompanying these ideas and these efforts to make sure that it's truly lasting change and that those changes can happen. Another suggestion is to rethink and democratize the economic and financial empowerment, exposing and replacing predatory practices that sometimes are licensed by us as a city, right? When we have these in our neighborhoods, like Port Richmond in Staten Island, for example, who have maybe 10 check cashing places and one bank, right? So we know exactly that the way our neighborhoods are structured sometimes leave no option to our community members to unfortunately fall in these predatory practices. So how can we build or provide access to economic empowerment that is based on values of solidarity, economy, community growth, and in places, again, like Staten Island, where, for example, immigrant workers are, according to a recent study by La Colmena, spending 73% of their income in housing and transportation alone. So how can you come out of poverty when that is the percentage that you're living month by month? Just to finish, build on transnational and translocal connection our immigrant and non-immigrant New Yorkers have in order to build economic development, cultural and other opportunities, raising the role that municipalities, not just here in New York, but around the world, can have in making sure these bridges happen. There are many examples of transnational and translocal bridges that currently exist between neighborhoods in New York City and local communities around the world that can be built on. Finally, again, listening to the most effective people by these practices. I think having the opportunity for folks to come forward and provide these ideas as much as we can, providing spaces for people to feel comfortable to do so. Also, I think it's important. And I think this way we're going to be getting the most ideas from really the ground up, which I feel are truly necessary for a lasting change. There is a collective realization that the current economic system is not only anti-worker, but it's not sustainable. And we have to develop new models and ecosystems. And New York City now has the opportunity to dismantle the structural racism and inequity that exists for far too long and ensure equal access and wealth and opportunities, regardless of any of our differences. And I think that this is the one chance that we have to do this, and we can't let it pass. Thank you very much.
Very much appreciated. Arva Rice.
Good afternoon, commissioners. I would like to thank the members of the Racial Justice Commission, led by my friend Jennifer Jones-Austin, for creating this open process where so many voices are able to weigh in on issues of racial inequity and structural racism. I know that you are behind time today, so I'm going to try to move as quickly as I can through this written testimony, so you all still have some opportunities for question and answer. I think it's important. I do think it is important to note that we think of New York as a northern city, but the fact is that New York City government, like those in the southern states, have played a huge role in developing and implementing policies that were at best subtly discriminatory and at worst obviously racist. So I am so pleased that you all have come together to have this conversation and to move this work forward. As some of you know, last year, the New York Urban League released our State of Black New York, which talked about utilizing data from our National Urban League, Robin Hood, and the Columbia University's Poverty and Early Childhood Tracker. We found a number of different statistics that have already been talked about today, so I will not go into great length about them. But we do know that according to the report that almost 50% of New Yorkers lack sufficient income to meet basic family needs. And 50% of the job growth since 2010 has been in industries with average annual wages under $40,000. And in addition, less than 1% of New Yorkers who are overwhelmingly white have made almost all of the financial gains in the last 50 years, which sets the stage for this important discussion. As a result of those statistics and those that you've heard all day today, my suggestions are aimed at strategies to increase the income and the assets of African-American families and communities. I know that you've already heard from my friend Michael Gardner and Gregg Bishop that have spoken wonderfully and well about the need to support small Black businesses. So since my time is short, I'll just weigh on a few things that have been already presented by your expert panelists, but hopefully in a bullet form to move us forward. Number one, I think there needs to be an increase in access to capital for small minority and women-owned businesses. We've heard a lot about that already. We need to expand the public and private support for community development financial institutions, CDFIs, which we've heard a lot about today. We need to reform and expand incentives for private equity, hedge fund, and asset managers to increase capital that is made available to small minority and women-owned businesses. And I understand that you spoke to Brad Lander, who is the presumed next comptroller for the city of New York, and a commitment to equity with the fund managers. There's been a lot of conversation, but actual movement towards having more African-American and Latino and Asian fund managers, as well as looking at where those funds are involved and invested in our communities. We want to encourage people to expand the federal income tax credit and track and make sure it's being utilized at its best advantage here in New York City. We want to support federal minimum wage and push for the full enactment of the state legislation here in New York City. And then the other one related to small businesses is, and we learned through the experience with people trying to get the PPP loan, is we need to reform credit scoring models so that the qualified small business owners have the opportunity to access affordable and sustainable business capital. So those are just a few under small business. Also looking at income. We need to dramatically increase funding for job training and the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, targeting funding to adult reentry and youth and older workers workforce training programs administered through national and regional intermediate community-based organization, as well as to municipal government. We need to enact a comprehensive summer youth employment initiative, which creates millions of paid summer jobs for urban, and this is for the national organization, urban, suburban, and rural youth, but clearly in New York City, for New York City youth. We should not be battling and fighting to get just 50,000 summer jobs. We should have a larger number of them, and also plenty of opportunities for young people between the ages of 18 and 22 as well. We want to enact comprehensive apprenticeship programs, which provide opportunities across all economic sectors for youth and young adults. The city has invested heavily in Well and CUNY as a partner. We think that's terrific, and that work needs to be continued and expanded. My last piece is around policy, but it's also about marketing. And I think that the New York City needs to make an investment in Black women. When you help a Black woman, you help the family, you help the community. And I think we need to think about how to do that unapologetically. The child tax credit is a step in a great direction, but the fact is that African-American women must work an extra 214 days of 2021 or a total of 579 days instead of 365 to earn what their white counterparts make in 365 days. We recently had Black Women's Equal Pay Day and found that Black women have to work almost a year and a half in order to earn what others earn in a year. So we need to develop tax incentives for corporations for hiring, promotion of Black women, as well as accountability within government itself for the advancement and promotion of government staff. When I was asked to speak on this panel today, I was told that I could talk in big terms about whether there was a commission that we wanted to dissolve, a government entity that we wanted to create. So if I was in charge of the world, I would create an agency that was responsible for the economic advancement of African American New Yorkers. Thank you.
Very much appreciated. It's 5:48 p.m. We began later than planned. If our panelists are able to join us until 6:10, or at least a few of you, if you're able to, we would appreciate that. If you're not, then we understand that as well. We're going to call on commission members who've raised their hands, and we will begin with Commissioner Garrido. Now, I should just say that I've been told that Mr. Mercado has to leave promptly at 6 p.m. And so I would just ask our commission members if the other panels are able to stay for an additional 10 minutes. And, if there are questions specifically for...
I'm able to stay for another 10 minutes. No worries.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then no worries. No worries. Thank you. Okay. So Vice Chair Garrido, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try to be brief. My first question is for Ms. Dixon. On August 2nd, the New York City Council revealed a report that showed that Black workers, city workers, particularly women, were making almost $22,000 less than the white counterparts. And it showed also major gaps among gender, not just color and race, which to me, it's a definable pattern of discrimination among our own city workers. And having represent 150,000 of them, it pained me to see that. But at the same time, I know historically this pattern has been there. And yet somehow every time we go through the discriminatory route of determining why there are these levers that are dealing with these low unemployment or laws that are creating and perpetuating these inequities, we get nowhere. The courts get you nowhere, or they bring it back to the cities. Like, this is a policy issue, not a discriminatory issue. I would be very curious to hear from your perspective why there doesn't seem to be a balance or a premise within the private industry seems to be pretty straightforward, but within government that allows these kinds of discrepancy to exist and be perpetuated.
Sure. So I haven't seen the report that you're listing, so just let you know that. Generally, there's a lot of reasons why there are wage gaps, and often they have to do with the qualifications that are required for positions. And so in government, it tends to be very rigid in terms of what they have and where you place them. So that may be contributing to it. But one of the things I would say that this panel may be interested in is that a lot of the reason why we don't have closure of these wage gaps is because we don't have any goals around closing these wage gaps. And if it seems kind of simple, but there aren't any goals, and we know goals are all about our intentions, and they kind of shape our actions. And what I've seen nationally is that these gaps are just widening, and that they're even there for millennials in the next generation of workers. So unless we actually take action, they're not going to close on their own. So I think figuring out how we have goals around this, and I'm sure you all do this, but publicly tracking progress using dashboards, things like that, is important.
My second question, thank you, by the way. My second question has to deal with the wage theft discussion around particularly entities that have made this their business model, that continuously are found guilty of wage theft and somehow continue to either do business with the city or business in the city. it's almost like the penalty is less than the continuous theft. And I wonder if there's anything that any of you have seen, even Mr. Mercado, or if anyone, have seen in the charter that would empower either an existing agency or some other entity to flag, disqualify, or perpetual or list these perennial abusers of wage theft in the city.
So there is a federal executive order that does what you're saying. So basically, the federal government doesn't contract with employers that commit wage theft. So it's something to look into in terms of whether there's an option for the city to do that as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Garrido. We're going to go to Commissioner Hamilton. If you're okay, Commissioner Hamilton, I do have a quick follow-up question to Rebecca Dixon based on Commissioner Garrido's line of questioning. Do you believe that there's more the city can and should do by way of charter to recognize the value of work in what has not been conventional forms? So day laborers, worker cooperatives. Do you think that there's more that can and should be done? Just using them as two examples.
I think absolutely there should be more done. There's this way that the labor market is stratified, and there's people on the top, in the middle, and the bottom. And it's based on a scarcity model, which is actually not true. There's abundant wealth in the United States. And so I think figuring out how we get out of this scarcity model and stop rationing opportunities and rationing status and all of that is important. And so being able to take that work and pull it out of this sort of way in which it's being classified as less than, I think that would be an important step towards it being valued the way it should be.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Hamilton.
Thank you. And Director Dixon, I'm going to keep you in the hot seat and direct another question related to employment discrimination your way, but of course anyone else can chime in as well. So audit studies are not so are kind of routine where people, municipal audits are not so foreign. People analyze trends, but you reference audit studies and testers early on as some direct and convincing evidence that you send actors that or resumes that are identical in terms of qualification, but vary in terms of race or gender, and that's clear and convincing evidence of discrimination. And just in the spirit of transparency, we are co-working on a paper together that's looking at using those tester model as a mechanism to enforce discrimination. So I want to see if you can elaborate or offer any insights on that as a solution where municipalities would routinely send out testers and test and see if discrimination is manifesting in individual transactions, and then have some teeth behind it of enforcement, that the threat that you might be audited by a tester coming to your establishment, if you're a city agency or you receive contracts with the city, will keep you from discriminating. Or if you are found to be in violation of discrimination, that you can be prosecuted. And what do you think of that as a mechanism of anti-discrimination?
I think it gets to the earlier question about why this municipal employment seems to have such wide gaps. And I think that, this is used in the housing context to send out testers. And so it's definitely something worth considering if we are serious about closing these gaps. And it may need to be paired with some additional training, education, and working with the agencies so that, they're on notice in terms of what they shouldn't be doing. But I think it's a great idea and might actually start to bring bring some of those gaps to a close.
Thank you. Are there other questions of commission members have for the panelists? Commissioner Thompson?
Yes, I have two questions. One to Gonzalo. Hi, Gonzalo. A lot of delivery work during the pandemic was done by undocumented immigrant workers, frontline workers. And now my understanding is like a lot of them are having their electric bikes stolen, sometimes, at knife point or gunpoint. And so I was curious to hear your thoughts on what things the city ought to think about doing to better protect and include immigrant workers, particularly undocumented workers. Your thoughts on that. So that was the first question. And the second general question to the panelists I have is, in what ways do you think technology is changing work? And what do you think the city ought to be doing about it to make sure that, workers of color in particular aren't disadvantaged in the growing tech economy?
Thank you, Commissioner Thompson. Yes, delivery workers in New York City, even before the pandemic, were experiencing very, very high levels of not only wage theft by the apps, right, that they work for, these tech apps, but also in their day-to-day work. And very little things like, we also see in the day labor workforce, for example, like access to a toilet, right? These are basic things that cab drivers, delivery workers, and day laborers have a common a need. So are very, very basic services. On top of that, delivery workers have been, during the pandemic, targeted not only with their bikes, which are very, very expensive especially for a worker who don't have $2,000 laying around to shop a bike that he can do his job on. Usually they have to save money, or they are in some sort of loan in order to pay for them, and also even access to repair them whenever they get they get damaged. But now we're also seeing extreme violence, and we had a specific episode of the murder of one of these workers, and really, really high incidence of attacks. For example, when workers are crossing bridges in order to deliver food. So I really would like to call attention. I know that there is a number of bills, and some of them have passed in the city council to see how these issues can be addressed. But I truly feel that the administration also, through this charter and understanding how work and the job shifted, right? And this is connecting also to your second question about tech work, which in a way, our experience, at least, it has been another tool to dismantle worker protections and exploit workers in the sake of profit. So I think we have, as I said earlier, a real opportunity here to look at all of this, to listen and meet with workers directly, and work with also the private sector. And how can we come to an agreement and a standard where all workers can go safely to their homes and have a living wage and be able to prosper, as some of these apps where, unfortunately, our experience so far is that they're basically taking advantage of workers for the sake of profit.
If I may respond also to the second question, and I think this touches also on the issue raised by Commissioner Garrido. It's sort of like the underinvestment over the last decade or so on workforce development and retraining for workers, both in the private sector and in the public sector, right? And so we actually have been seeing the last year or two situations in which workers were trying to go to school to learn another trade, or who are engaging, maybe being recruited by trucking companies. They have to first pay for this like expensive certificates in order to be able to get hired, and they never get hired. And that is because there's this huge gap where there aren't opportunities now for workers to get retraining that is paid by with public funds, right? So with technology, that obviously the workers are facing a lot of challenges with that. But even when technology is trying to, is being used with good intentions, I think it's still going to displace workers, and we need to invest in these programs. And I know the city has an interest in that, but certainly it would go to address some of the issues where, as Rebecca mentioned, a lot of maybe the civil service delineations for certain jobs are very strict, and the qualifications for the jobs. And we need to be preparing our city workers to retraining them so they can access those other levels of work.
I would just chime in on this technology question. So there's definitely an impact that we can see on the horizon with algorithms. Using an algorithm to target jobs to certain people or to avoid certain people. So there's an algorithm that does online recruiting, and it excludes people who have liked pages in Spanish. And there's also things where they target zip codes, and we know that housing is highly segregated. So those are some of the things that are like on the cusp in terms of taking what we know is discrimination and sort of embedding it in the algorithms and perpetuating it. And then there's an element of technology that is not new, right? So as Gonzalo was saying, we are seeing them use these apps to exploit people. And essentially wage theft and exploitation, those are like old things that have been going on for a long time. So classifying workers as independent contractors when they're actually employees, so you don't have to pay them benefits and all of that. That's all old. So in some ways, what's old is new again. And there are these foundational ways that we didn't do the labor law correctly the first time around, which created these loopholes that then can be exploited in many different ways, and technology is just one of the new ones.
Yeah. So I have two questions, and I guess one is I'd like you to offer like thoughts and reflections, and then the second is a question. So, I grew up being taught that essentially that racism is really a construct to ensure a capitalist society where some would have and others would not. And that, the laws, the policies, and the programs that we have in place are designed to hold that system of capitalism and inequity up. And so I guess I'd like to hear some of your thoughts and reflections about how do we. What I'm concerned about is a lot of the talk about, like what we need to do economically centers on policy solutions. And that's the space in which we play, right? And changes in laws. But at the root, if we understand the connection of racism to capitalism, what must be done at the root? Are we, how do I say this? Are we, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, I'm just struggling with this. Are we creating responses to address the problem? Or are we uprooting the problem itself? And I'd appreciate, and you may have thoughts at this moment, you may not, but I need some help here with that. Because what I'm concerned about is that this society has found a way time and time again of when we create a response, policy or otherwise, they figure out a workaround. And so how do we get to dismantling the role that racism plays in this capitalist society without necessarily dismantling capitalism? Or maybe we do. So it's a thought. I'm asking for thoughts, and maybe you have them at this point. Perhaps you don't, but I'd love your thoughts, if not now, at some point about that. And then my second question is, or my second point, Arva Rice spoke about creating an office centered on addressing inequity as visited upon African Americans. And I'm curious if that's a balance of both reparations and forward thinking. I'd like to hear more about that.
I know our time is short. I wanted to quickly answer the first thought that you had, Jennifer. And I think that the key to making sure that we're always addressing things at a systematic level is having Jennifer Jones Austin at your table whenever you're doing strategy, so that she keeps asking this question, right? So that you keep pushing yourself to say, is this something that's just getting at the symptoms, or is this really getting at the actual root, right? And you just have to keep asking it over and over and over again, because at the point when you get to something that's systematic, like you said, the shells are shifted. So I just think it's a question that we just need to keep asking over and over and over again. And in this Office of Economic Advancement, I do see it as a place that, number one, is unapologetically about advancing the needs and the issues of those who have been left out of the system. And as each one of the terrific panelists today have talked about, whether it's through housing policy, whether it's through banking policies, whether it's through income disparities, but like it's left us at this place that we're in right now, right? So it would be a place in a space that is about really addressing those issues at a government level. So it's helping people to navigate. And I know that the city already has navigator programs, but I think it's some portion of navigation. I do love the idea of it being some part of reparations as well. Come here and get your 40 acres and a mule. And also about ways in which to level that when it comes to income inequities, because like I said, I really think that truly is the root, that we're still making less money on a dollar. And until that gets erased, addressed, we're going to continue in this existing cycle. And I think that for the African American college graduated woman, it's here. But if you talk about, talking about somebody who is experiencing some of the things that Gonzalo was speaking about, it's down here, so it's like unfair and unfair, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's where we really need to address our efforts.
I have a very practical answer to your first question. And it's something that we're trying to do as an organization, and that is centering equity in policy design and implementation. So we're not doing race-blind policy. We're not acting like there are no racial impacts. So I think the first thing is representation matters. So, if we have a situation where a lot of our policy is being made by 80-year-old white men, that's the policy we're going to get. So making sure that we have folks at the table who are representative and who can bring their wisdom, passion, and insights to the policy making. Second, I would say we need to look at historical and present day inequities. What does the data tell us about who's most advantaged and most disadvantaged by a specific policy? And ask ourselves those questions before we pass the policy. Likewise, we want to consider intended and unintended impacts, and which workers might be most burdened by the recommendations. And we need to think about that when we're making trade-offs. And then lastly, I would say power and participation is important. And so how are workers and communities engaged? And are there opportunities to expand that? And how do we keep them engaged? Because it's a completely different policy when it's informed by the needs and priorities of directly impacted folks versus sort of being on high and theoretically using data and all of that. So those were the concrete ways that we are trying to center equity in our policy making to make sure that it's getting at the root cause and that systems change approach.
Very helpful.
I'll make
we're going to keep just a few more minutes, but Lorelei?
Just very quick observation. Not clear whether you can actually append the system via the charter, but I do, one thought that I have had, and I will confess that I do not think that our existing labor laws are going to be sufficient to address the issues that workers are facing today, right? Mm-hmm. And so there has to be a lot more outside of the labor law that we need to do in order to restore the balance of power that corporations now have, like all of the power over workers and consumers. So I do believe that what we need, the strategies that need to be in place, have to be transformational. It require like the thinking of several different institutions at the table and not just trying to fit a labor law to accommodate an economy that it just doesn't match anymore. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm really glad that you guys are really thinking that way and thinking big.
Thank you. Gonzalo, any last words that you'd like to share with the panel?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everyone. I think that the role that government can play here is a ground setting role, calling out that there are practices that we think may not be still happening in parts of our city. And I would even include the criminalization of labor violations like wage theft, for example, and others. Also health and safety violations that either land workers handicapped for life or death, and that high rates disproportionately do affect immigrant undocumented workers. And the second piece would be investment. And once we have that ground setting, having that equitable investment and building these ecosystems and building on models that are happening, they are interesting, they are important, they are keeping the pace, with this changing economy, are a couple of ideas on top of everything that everyone just said that I truly agree with.
Excellent. This has been most informative, helpful to me, and I'm sure my fellow commissioners. I ask on behalf of the entire commission, both the commissioners and the leadership and staff, that we are able to come back to you as we continue on this journey to unpack some of the ideas that you presented to us, to perhaps even flesh out things that have been brought to our attention by others. And so with your permission, we will do just that. And just want to thank you again for your time and for your work, your tremendous work on behalf of New Yorkers, especially those who are marginalized and oppressed. So thank you. We have a meeting tomorrow if you want to listen in. We have a public engagement session at the Schomburg, where we hope to hear from people from across the city. We're going borough by borough, but people from other parts of the city are welcome to come to any particular borough. And tomorrow we'll be at the Schomburg Center from 5 to 8 p.m. talking with people about their experiences, their thoughts, and their ideas to help make this commission and what it needs to be. So thank you all. I wish you a good evening.
I mean, there are going to be a lot of